I am Imani, 30 years old, and for a very long time I believed the cruel lies my family told me about my own mind. Growing up in a household obsessed with elite social status, there was no room for imperfection. Today, I am entirely free of their toxicity. But the past has a funny way of knocking on your door when you least expect it. It was a Sunday afternoon in Atlanta, the kind of crisp, sunlit day that felt designed for absolute peace. I was sitting in my formal living room, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked my private gardens. I was hosting a quiet, elegant tea service for my husband Julian and his parents. Julian's parents are brilliant, warm academics who have always engaged me in deep intellectual conversations. We were discussing a new historical documentary over Earl Grey tea and delicate pastries arranged beautifully on my white marble coffee table. The atmosphere was incredibly peaceful. It was safe. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, status-obsessed household I grew up in. For the first time in my adult life, I knew what a real family felt like. A family that valued my presence and never once made me feel like an obligation or a mistake. Then, a heavy, violent thud against my custom mahogany front doors vibrated through the marble floors of my foyer. It was not a polite knock. It was aggressive, entitled, and relentless. Julian set his teacup down instantly, his brow furrowing in immediate concern. His father stopped speaking mid-sentence, looking toward the entryway. My smart home security panel flashed a bright red warning on the wall. When I glanced at the live video feed on my tablet, the breath completely caught in my throat. Standing on my front porch, glaring into the camera lens with absolute fury, were my biological parents, Beatrice and Desmond. Flanking them was my twin sister Kiara, looking perfectly polished, with her signature arrogant sneer, and her husband Connor Kensington. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs, but my face remained perfectly still. I had not seen or spoken to my parents in 18 years. Not since the day they packed my belongings into 2 cheap trash bags, handed me over to Uncle Silas, and drove away from his house without looking back even once. Now they were standing at my doorstep, uninvited, unannounced, and clearly enraged. I walked toward the foyer, Julian stepping protectively close behind me. I unlocked and opened the heavy double doors. Before I could even ask how they had bypassed the neighborhood security gate, Connor shoved his way past me. He did not ask for permission to enter my home. He simply stepped over the threshold with the staggering arrogance of a man who believed the entire world belonged to him. Connor came from a long line of generational white wealth, old money that opened doors and silenced questions. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and gave me a condescending smile. He proudly announced that he had simply called the owner of the private security firm a golfing buddy of his father to authorize their entry. He said it with a smug grin, fully establishing his upper-class entitlement and his belief that rules did not apply to him. He looked around my pristine foyer, his eyes scanning the high ceilings and the expensive original art on the walls. He clearly assumed I was renting the place, or perhaps drowning in massive debt to afford a lifestyle far above my station. He radiated that classic white savior energy, treating me like an incompetent child who needed managing. Beatrice pushed her way in right behind him. My mother was dressed to the nines in a custom silk suit and a wide-brimmed hat, perfectly coordinated for a high-society church gala. She operated entirely on respectability politics, obsessed with maintaining an image of flawless excellence for her congregation and her exclusive country club friends. She marched into my living room, her expensive perfume instantly overpowering the delicate scent of our tea. She completely ignored Julian and his parents, who were standing up in shock at the sudden home invasion. Kiara trailed behind her, her designer heels clicking sharply against my marble floors, bringing the toxic family dynamic right back into my safe space. Beatrice did not say hello. She did not ask how I had been for the last 2 decades. She did not shed a tear or offer an embrace to the daughter she had thrown away. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick legal dossier, and slammed it down onto the center of my marble coffee table. The impact rattled the tea service violently, causing hot tea to splash over the rim of a delicate cup and stain the pristine white tablecloth. "You are going to sign this today?" Beatrice demanded, her voice echoing shrilly against the high ceilings. I do not have time to chase you around Atlanta. You were always slow, Imani. Slow to learn, slow to understand basic instructions. But I need you to focus and sign this paper right now. I stood completely still, my eyes moving from the spilled tea to the thick stack of legal documents. The sheer audacity of her intrusion was suffocating. I looked at Desmond, the man who had helped give me life only to discard me when I did not fit his perfect image. He was checking his heavy gold watch, shifting his weight impatiently in his tailored suit. Listen to your mother, Imani. Desmond barked, completely ignoring the fact that he was trespassing in a stranger's home. We have the Heritage Foundation Gala in 2 hours, and we are seated at the pastor's table. We do not have time for games. Just sign the transfer agreement. Your Uncle Silas left you a barren piece of dirt out in the country, and it is completely useless to you. You do not know the first thing about property management or taxes. It is a burden, Imani. You have always been a burden to this family, and keeping that land is just another burden you cannot handle. The word burden hung in the air, heavy and toxic. It was the exact word they used when I was 12 years old, struggling with undiagnosed dyslexia. They had refused to pay for specialized tutors or learning resources because it did not look good for their perfect family image to have a child who needed extra help. Kiara was the golden child, the future doctor, the one who read perfectly and memorized textbooks effortlessly. I was the slow one, the embarrassment. They shipped me off to Uncle Silas, a free-spirited jazz musician they openly despised, just to scrub the stain of my academic struggles from their immaculate record. Now, 18 years later, they were standing in my house, using the exact same psychological weapons to break me down. They wanted to strip away my confidence by reminding me of my deepest childhood insecurities. Slow, a burden, not smart enough. The repetition of those words was meant to paralyze me. Beatrice tapped a manicured finger against the thick dossier. This is just a barren plot of land, Imani. She sneered, her voice dripping with disgust. It is worthless to someone like you. Connor is willing to take it off your hands and put it into a trust for your sister Kiara. You should be thanking us for dealing with this mess. Sign the papers so we can leave. We cannot be late for the gala. Image is everything, and dealing with you is exhausting my patience. I looked at Kiara, my twin sister, the golden child who had everything handed to her on a silver platter. She stood next to Connor with a smug expression, looking at my unbranded clothing, completely failing to recognize the quiet luxury of my lifestyle. She actually thought I was a failure. She actually thought I needed their intervention. She rolled her eyes, sighing loudly, as if my very existence was an inconvenience to her busy schedule. I did not take the pen. Beatrice shoved toward me. I did not raise my voice. I did not revert to the terrified, heartbroken 12-year-old girl they expected me to be. Instead, I slowly walked over to the coffee table. I picked up my teacup, wiping the spilled liquid from the base with a linen napkin, and took a calm, deliberate sip. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. Julian stood silently in the corner, his eyes sharp and observant, letting me take the lead. His parents watched the spectacle with quiet horror, seeing firsthand the monsters I had survived. My family wanted a reaction. They wanted compliance born of fear and self-doubt. But they were about to find out that the slow child they abandoned was no longer playing their game. The silence in the living room stretched thick and suffocating. Beatrice absolutely hated silence. In her world, silence meant she was not actively controlling the narrative. She stepped closer to the marble coffee table, her posture rigid, her eyes narrowing as I took another slow, deliberate sip of my tea. Did you not hear me, Imani? Beatrice snapped, her voice losing its polished country club veneer. Put the teacup down. You are always so unbelievably slow. Slow to process simple commands, slow to understand your place in this family. I am talking to you, and I expect you to listen. I lowered the porcelain cup back to its saucer. The soft, precise clink was the only sound in the room. I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch. Kiara scoffed, shifting her weight and crossing her arms over her expensive silk blouse. You really have not changed at all, have you? She sneered, still staring off into space with that blank look on your face, still not smart enough to grasp the reality of the situation. Mom and Dad are trying to help you, Imani, just like they tried to help you when we were 12. When we were 12. The year they finalized my banishment. I remembered it vividly. I remembered sitting at the dining room table, staring at a history textbook as the letters swam and twisted across the page. I remembered Beatrice ripping the book from my hands, screaming that I was doing it on purpose to embarrass her. They never bothered to have me tested. They never cared to discover that my brain simply processed information non-linearly, a classic symptom of dyslexia. To them, a diagnosis would mean a flaw in their genetic perfection. It was much easier to simply label me as defective. You were a burden then, and you are a burden now, Kiara continued, leaning forward as if speaking to a toddler. Do you remember how you used to humiliate us at the country club? You could not even read the dinner menu out loud when the pastor and his wife joined us for Sunday brunch. You made Mom cry from the sheer embarrassment. You could never keep up with me. I was getting straight A's, winning science fairs, getting accepted into advanced placement programs, and you were just holding us back. You were always holding us back. You are simply not smart enough to handle adult responsibilities, let alone a piece of commercial property. Desmond let out a heavy, exasperated sigh. He tapped his gold watch again, his face turning a shade of angry red. We do not have all day to coddle her, Beatrice. Imani, listen to me. You are not smart enough to manage real estate. You could not even manage middle school reading comprehension. Your Uncle Silas was an eccentric fool to leave this land to you. It was a mistake. A fool leaving a burden to another burden. He was a struggling jazz musician who lived in a fantasy world, and he encouraged your delusions. We are living in the real world. In the real world, property means taxes, liabilities, and legal obligations that you are entirely incapable of comprehending. Beatrice nodded in vigorous agreement, stepping right up to the edge of the coffee table. Exactly. You have always been a burden, Imani. We signed you over to Silas because we could not let your failures drag your sister down. Kiara had a future. She had medical school ahead of her. She had a reputation to build. You were a slow, difficult child who required far too much patience. We did what had to be done to protect the family name. And now we are doing what has to be done to protect this asset. The sheer cruelty of her words hung in the beautiful sunlit room. Julian's mother, a retired professor of literature who had spent her career advocating for neurodivergent students, looked physically sickened. She opened her mouth to speak, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair, but Julian caught her eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. He knew my plan. He knew that interrupting them now would only give them an excuse to play the victim. He let them continue digging their own graves. It really is tragic. Kiara mocked her lips, curving into a cruel, pitying smile. You must be terrified living alone, probably bouncing from one low-paying job to another because you cannot pass a basic aptitude test. We are actually saving you. Connor is willing to take this massive financial burden off your hands. Why are you fighting us? Why do you always have to make things so difficult? You are not smart enough to play these games, Imani. Just be a good, obedient girl for once in your life and sign the papers. The repetition was intentional, slow, burden, not smart enough. They were trying to trigger a trauma response. They wanted me to revert to the 12-year-old girl who used to hide in her closet, crying, until she threw up because her parents told her she was too stupid to love. They wanted me to shrink. They wanted me to doubt my own reality and surrender my agency to the people who had abused me. But I did not shrink. I looked at the four of them standing in my home, breathing my air, entirely blind to the reality of who I had become. They saw a quiet, unbranded woman standing in a minimalist room, and they assumed poverty and incompetence. They did not recognize that the unbranded clothes I wore were bespoke pieces flown in from Milan. They did not realize that the minimalist decor was curated by one of the top interior design firms in the country. They were so blinded by their own prejudice and their desperate need to feel superior that they completely failed to assess the environment they had just invaded. Connor huffed loudly, crossing his arms over his chest. His patience was visibly fraying. "Look, we are dealing with someone who clearly lacks the mental capacity for basic logic," he said, looking at Desmond instead of me. "Beatrice. Desmond, maybe we should just have the family lawyers draft a letter of incompetency. We can petition the court to assign Kiara as her legal guardian. It might take a few weeks, but it would solve this problem permanently. If she is too slow to sign a simple piece of paper, she clearly needs psychiatric supervision." Beatrice smiled a terrifying predatory expression that chilled the room. "That is a wonderful idea, Connor. Imani, did you hear that? If you do not sign this transfer agreement right now, we will have you declared legally incompetent. You will lose what little independence you have managed to scrape together. Do not force us to take drastic measures. You are a burden we do not want to carry again. Sign the paper." I slowly lowered my hands to my lap. The psychological attack had reached its absolute peak. They had laid all their weapons on the table, confident that I was utterly defenseless. They had brought up my darkest childhood insecurities, threatened my autonomy, and insulted the only man who had ever truly loved me like a father. They thought their words were breaking me down. They had no idea they were just giving me the green light to absolutely destroy them. I reached out and pulled the thick legal dossier across the marble table toward me. I did not pick up the silver pen Connor had tossed down. Instead, I opened the folder, letting my eyes scan the first page of the contract. The text did not swim or twist. It was perfectly crystal clear. I let my eyes trace the stark black ink printed on the heavy bond paper. The letters did not dance. The paragraphs did not blur. The text remained perfectly anchored to the page, revealing a hastily drafted, incredibly sloppy piece of legal work. I turned to the second page, the crisp rustle of the paper echoing loudly in the tense living room. Kiara let out a sharp, theatrical sigh. She shifted her weight, crossing her arms tighter, and leaned her head against Connor's shoulder. She did not even bother to lower her voice. "She cannot even read the bold print, Connor, let alone the fine print." Kiara mocked, her tone dripping with absolute contempt. "She is just staring at the page, hoping the words will magically translate themselves. It is like watching a dog look at a calculus textbook. We could have handed her a restaurant menu and told her it was a deed, and she would not know the difference. She was always too slow to comprehend basic sentences, too slow to grasp simple concepts. Just take the pen and put an X on the line Imani. That is all you need to do." I did not look up. I slowly turned to the third page. "Are you deaf as well as slow?" Beatrice snapped, her patience entirely evaporated. "Stop pretending you understand a single word on that document. You are embarrassing yourself." I flattened the dossier against the marble table. I placed my index finger on the middle of the fourth page, looking directly at Connor. "Clause 4, subsection B," I said. My voice was steady, resonant, and completely devoid of emotion. "This is an indemnification clause designed to transfer all existing environmental liabilities to the grantor. That means if there are any hazardous materials or unresolved EPA violations on Uncle Silas's land, I would remain personally financially responsible for the cleanup even after transferring the deed to you. You are not just taking the land, you are attempting to make me the permanent guarantor for any corporate negligence you commit on the property." The room went dead silent. Julian's father raised his eyebrows, a small, proud smile touching the corners of his mouth. Connor stopped leaning against the sofa. His posture instantly stiffened. I turned to page 7, my movements smooth and unhurried. "Then there is the zoning waiver right here under section 8. I continued, my gaze locking onto Desmond, who was suddenly staring at me with a bizarre mix of shock and outrage. "This waiver explicitly relinquishes all commercial development rights, but it does not relinquish them to Connor's trust. It assigns them to a third-party shell entity listed as Apex Holdings, LLC. A quick cross-reference of Georgia state corporate registries would likely show that Apex Holdings is not a blind trust, but a holding company heavily leveraged in debt. You are using this land to collateralize a failing corporate structure. Beatrice opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her perfectly painted lips simply parted in stunned silence. I flipped to the final page, tapping the bottom paragraph. And finally, I said, leaning back into my chair and folding my hands neatly in my lap. The severability and perpetuity clauses violate the fundamental rule against perpetuities in Georgia state property law. This contract attempts to vest interest in unborn beneficiaries of Kiara's trust beyond the standard 21-year vesting period. That structural flaw renders this entire assignment voidable upon execution. Any competent junior attorney would have caught this. Whoever drafted this document for you was either breathtakingly lazy or assumed the person signing it was incredibly stupid. I looked at Kiara. I looked at Beatrice. I looked at Connor. So tell me, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch, which one of us is actually too slow to understand what is written on this paper? Which one of us is truly not smart enough to grasp the reality of the situation? For 10 agonizing seconds, the grand living room felt like a vacuum. The psychological tension pulled tight, stretching to the absolute breaking point. Connor's face drained of its smug, entitled color, replaced by a pale, sickly shade of panic. He looked down at the dossier as if it had suddenly caught fire. Desmond blinked rapidly, his jaw working as he tried to process the advanced legal and financial terminology that had just effortlessly rolled off the tongue of his discarded daughter. Then the psychological defense mechanisms kicked in. Their egos simply could not absorb the reality standing in front of them. The fragile elite reality they had built their entire identities upon demanded that I remain the defective child. Desmond shook his head vigorously, letting out a loud, forced laugh that sounded completely hollow. He pointed a trembling finger at me. Do not try to use big words you do not understand, Imani. Desmond barked, his voice rising in volume to mask his sudden insecurity. You memorized that. You probably watched some legal drama on television last night and memorized a bunch of random jargon to sound smart. You do not know what an indemnification clause is. You are just repeating syllables. Beatrice instantly seized the lifeline Desmond threw her. The color rushed back to her face as she nodded, frantically clutching her designer handbag against her chest. Exactly! Beatrice gasped, waving her hand dismissively. It is a fluke, a wild guess. She is just repeating things she heard someone else say. A broken clock is right twice a day. Do not play these childish games with us, Imani. You cannot even spell the word perpetuity, let alone define it in a court of law. You are just trying to stall because you are confused and overwhelmed. Kiara stepped forward again, her arrogance returning, though her eyes betrayed a deep, frantic anxiety. She grabbed Connor's arm, pulling him slightly back as if to shield him from my words. She is bluffing, Connor. Kiara insisted, her voice shrill and desperate. She is just bluffing to save face in front of her little friends. Look at her. She is a college dropout who probably lives paycheck to paycheck. She is not smart enough to audit a real estate contract. She is a burden. She has always been a burden. Just ignore her little performance and make her sign the document. They clung to the narrative like drowning sailors clinging to a piece of driftwood. Slow. Burden. Not smart enough. They repeated the words over and over, trying to speak their preferred reality back into existence. They were desperately trying to stuff me back into the tiny, suffocating box they had built for me 18 years ago. I watched them scramble. I watched them lie to themselves. I watched them unravel. They had absolutely no idea that the real destruction had not even begun. Kiara took a bold step forward, her sharp designer heels clicking aggressively against the polished marble floor. She needed to reclaim the high ground. She needed to prove that she was still the superior twin, the flawless prodigy, the ultimate success story of the family. If she could not beat me with intellect, she would try to crush me with superficiality. It was the only language she truly understood. She looked me up and down, her gaze sweeping over my outfit with theatrical pity. I was wearing a simple tailored cream cashmere sweater and matching wide-leg trousers. There were no logos. There were no flashy, monogrammed prints screaming for attention. To Kiara, whose entire self-worth was tied to the size of the designer emblem across her chest, the absence of a visible brand meant absolute failure. "Look at you, Imani." Kiara sneered, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Look at this sad, empty little life you have scraped together. You are sitting here trying to sound like some big corporate lawyer, but you cannot even afford a decent outfit. You are wearing a plain beige sweatsuit. You do not have a single piece of jewelry on. You do not even have a designer bag in sight. You are probably renting this house with 5 other roommates just to afford the utility bills. It is pathetic. It really is." She gestured wildly around my formal living room. The space was a masterclass in minimalist architectural design. The furniture was custom-built by a world-renowned studio in Copenhagen. The artwork on the walls consisted of original contemporary pieces that belonged in museum galleries. But Kiara only saw bare walls and neutral tones. She saw a lack of gilded mirrors, crystal chandeliers, and velvet-tufted sofas. She saw a space that did not scream new money, and her brain immediately translated that into poverty. "This room is completely barren." Kiara laughed, a harsh grating sound that echoed in the vast space. "You cannot even afford to furnish your own living room. There is literally nothing here. It is just empty space. You are trying to act so high and mighty, pretending you know about zoning waivers and trust funds, but the reality is written all over your cheap clothes and your empty house. You are broke. You are struggling. You are exactly the failure Mom and Dad always knew you would be." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I did not bother to inform her that the plain beige sweater she was mocking cost more than her entire heavily branded outfit. I did not mention that the empty space she was criticizing was a deliberate design choice to highlight the natural light and the expensive, sustainably sourced materials used to construct the room. I let her continue talking, allowing her to expose the absolute shallowness of her entire existence. "You should look at me and take notes," Kiara boasted, puffing out her chest to make sure the interlocking logo on her silk blouse was clearly visible. "I am a board-certified cosmetic dermatologist. I own the most prestigious medical spa in Buckhead. I cater to the real elite of Atlanta. Actors, politicians, wives of professional athletes. People who actually have money. I drive a car that costs more than your entire life earnings. I am married to a man whose family practically built this city. I am the golden child Imani. I did everything right. I followed the rules, I worked hard, and I earned my perfect life." And Beatrice nodded proudly, her chest swelling as she looked at her successful daughter. "That is right, Kiara. Tell her. She needs to hear the truth. She needs a harsh dose of reality." "You were always a burden," Kiara continued, leaning over the coffee table, her face twisting with a lifetime of unchecked arrogance. "You held me back. You embarrassed me. I had to spend my entire childhood overcompensating for your stupidity. I had to be perfect because you were so hopelessly defective. And look at where we ended up. I am standing at the absolute top of the social ladder, and you are sitting in an unfurnished rental house, pretending to read a legal contract you cannot possibly comprehend." Connor stepped up beside his wife, wrapping a supportive arm around her waist. He smiled down at me, the quintessential image of a wealthy, benevolent patriarch dealing with a difficult charity case. "Kiara is right, Imani." Connor said, his voice lowering into a faux, soothing tone. "There is no shame in admitting you are out of your depth. We are not here to judge your living situation or your financial struggles. We are actually here to help. That $50,000 we are offering for your uncle's land is a gift. It is a lifeline. You could use that money to buy some decent furniture. You could buy some actual clothes. You could start over somewhere nice and quiet, somewhere you do not have to pretend to be something you are not." The sheer delusion radiating from the two of them was almost suffocating. They measured human value in logos, zip codes, and performative wealth. They believed that because they shouted their status from the rooftops, it made it real. They had absolutely no concept of quiet luxury. They had no idea that true power did not need to scream for attention. True power whispered. I glanced at Julian. He was watching Kiara with an expression of mild clinical fascination, like a scientist observing a particularly loud and obnoxious insect. His parents remained seated, their posture relaxed, but their eyes sharp. They were part of a generational academic legacy, people who valued intellect and integrity above all else. Kiara's vulgar display of materialism was incredibly distasteful to them, but they remained politely silent, allowing the spectacle to unfold. "You are just jealous," Kiara snapped, misinterpreting my silence for defeat. "You have always been jealous of me. Jealous of my brain, jealous of my looks, jealous of my husband. You want to sabotage this land transfer because you cannot stand the thought of me getting even richer. You want to hold on to that useless dirt just to spite me. It is petty, Imani. It is petty and it is pathetic." She reached across the table, tapping the legal dossier aggressively with her manicured fingernail. "You are going to take that pen," she commanded, her voice rising to a shrill crescendo. "You are going to sign this paper. You are going to take the check Connor so generously offered you. And then you are going to go back to being the invisible, slow little burden you have always been. Do not test me, Imani. You do not have the money, the intelligence, or the power to go up against me. I am a queen in this city. You are absolutely nothing." I let her words hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. The hostility was palpable, a toxic cloud that had choked me for the first 12 years of my life. But I was no longer breathing their poisoned air. I had built my own atmosphere. I had built an empire. I looked at Kiara, taking in her flashy clothes, her frantic energy, and the desperate gaping insecurity hiding just beneath her flawless makeup. She thought she was untouchable. She thought her medical spa and her wealthy husband made her a god. She was about to learn a very brutal lesson about the difference between looking rich and actually possessing the power to ruin someone's life. I simply smiled, a slow, terrifying smile that finally made the arrogance on her face falter. The performance was over. It was time to pull back the curtain. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool marble of the coffee table. My absolute silence acted like a vacuum in the room, pulling all the frantic, unanchored energy right out of them. People who are lying absolutely despise silence. It forces them to fill the void, and when they fill the void, they make mistakes. Desmond was the first to break. He abandoned his post beside my mother and began pacing across my living room, dragging a heavy hand roughly over his balding head. He was the picture of a man crumbling under an invisible ticking clock. He checked his gold watch for the fourth time in 5 minutes, but I noticed his hand was trembling. "Stop smiling at us and sign the document!" Desmond shouted, his voice cracking with a high-pitched edge of desperation that completely ruined his authoritative facade. "We do not have time to sit here and play these mind games with you. The banks are breathing down our necks. We have appearances to maintain. We have a lifestyle to uphold. Do you have any idea how much pressure this family is under to keep everything afloat? Kiara, tell your husband to fix this right now. Tell him to get this wrapped up so we can leave." Kiara whipped her head around to glare at her father, her eyes wide with sudden, unfiltered panic. "Dad, shut up," she hissed completely, dropping her polished Southern belle routine. "Do not bring the banks into this." We agreed not to discuss the restructuring in front of her. She is going to get confused and ask questions she is not smart enough to understand. But the damage was already done. The polished veneer was cracking rapidly, exposing the rotting wood underneath. Connor stepped forward again, but the effortless swagger was completely gone. He reached up and loosened his expensive silk tie, a bead of sweat visibly forming along his hairline. The wealthy, benevolent patriarch routine evaporated, replaced by the frantic aggression of a cornered animal. He snatched the silver pen from the table and aggressively thrust it toward my face. "Listen to me very carefully, Imani," Connor demanded, his face turning a blotchy, uneven shade of red. "I am offering you $50,000 in a cashier check right now. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to liquidate capital in this current economic climate? My portfolio managers have my primary trust fund temporarily restricted due to some minor overseas investments. It is a standard compliance freeze. It means absolutely nothing. But I need this land transfer executed today so I can leverage the deed for a bridge loan." Kiara needs the cash injection for her clinic. Just take the money and be a good sister. I did not take the pen. I tilted my head, my eyes locking onto his sweating face. A standard compliance freeze on a generational trust fund. That was a beautiful way to describe being completely cut off by your own family for reckless financial behavior. Kiara stepped in front of her husband, her hands curled into tight, trembling fists at her sides. "Connor, I told you to stop talking," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against my high ceilings. "Do not tell her about the clinic. The contractors are threatening to walk off the site by Friday if I do not pay them for the expansion. We need that federal payout by next quarter, or we are going to lose the Buckhead property. Just force her to sign it." A sharp collective gasp sucked the air right out of the room. Beatrice clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes darting between Kiara and me in absolute terror. Desmond froze mid-pace, his face draining of all color. Kiara instantly realized what she had just said. She clamped her jaw shut, her eyes widening in sheer horror, as the fatal slip hung suspended in the quiet atmosphere of my living room. "Federal payout," I repeated. My voice was soft, calm, and incredibly dangerous. I let the two words settle over them, watching as the realization of their mistake crushed the last remnants of their arrogance. Connor swallowed hard, his chest heaving nervously as he took a step back. "It is nothing," he stammered, holding up his hands defensively. "It is just a minor infrastructure grant. The county is doing some minor rezoning out near your uncle's property. It is highly technical government bureaucracy. Nothing you need to worry your pretty little head about. Just sign the deed, Imani." I slowly stood up from my chair. I smoothed the front of my cashmere sweater, taking my time, letting them drown in the agonizing suspense. I walked around the marble coffee table, closing the distance until I was standing merely inches away from Kiara and Connor. "You are referring to the Department of Transportation." I stated, my tone completely conversational, but lined with razor-sharp precision. Specifically, the newly approved federal interstate highway expansion project that was greenlit by the state legislature last month. The expansion project that happens to run directly through the exact geographic center of Uncle Silas's barren piece of dirt. Desmond took a heavy step backward, knocking into an end table. Beatrice let out a soft whimpering sound, clutching her designer bag like a shield. Uncle Silas was an eccentric jazz musician. I continued, my voice gaining a steady, relentless momentum. But he was not a fool. He knew exactly what he was buying 20 years ago. He bought a massive, undeveloped tract of land sitting squarely on a major geographic choke point. He knew the city would eventually have to expand outward. And when the federal government exercises eminent domain to seize private property for a public interstate, they are legally required to compensate the landowner at the highest possible commercial market value. I paused, looking directly into Kiara's terrified eyes. "Let me do some quick math for you," I said, leaning in closer. "Since you all seem to think I struggle so deeply with numbers, a 200-acre plot of land sitting directly on a proposed federal highway interchange in a rapidly developing commercial zone. The eminent domain valuation for that specific acreage is currently projected at roughly $15 million. The number hit them like a physical blow. Kiara physically stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the rug. Connor's face lost whatever color it had left, turning a sickly, translucent white. $15 million, I repeated slowly, letting the massive figure echo in the silent room. "And you came into my home, insulted my intelligence, mocked my lifestyle, and tried to trick me into signing it away for $50,000. You wanted to steal $14,950,000 from the sister you threw away, just so you could pay off your failing clinic contractors and cover up the fact that your wealthy husband managed to bankrupt his own trust fund." Beatrice rushed forward, her hands raised in a desperate, placating gesture. "Imani. Sweetheart, please listen to reason," she begged, her voice trembling violently. "We are your family. We were going to manage the money for you. You do not know how to handle $15 million. It would ruin your life. People would take advantage of you. We were protecting you from predators. We were going to put it in a safe account for you and give you an allowance. We are doing this out of love." I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that held absolutely zero warmth. Out of love. You came here to rob me blind to save yourselves from total financial ruin. Kiara's lifestyle is drowning you all in debt. Connor has gambled away his safety net. Dad is panicking about maintaining appearances at the country club. You are all sinking, and you thought you could use the slow, defective daughter as a financial life raft. You thought I would be too stupid to notice the highway expansion notices. You thought I would be too eager for your validation to read the fine print. I picked up the $50,000 check Connor had thrown on the table. I held it up between two fingers, inspecting it like a piece of garbage I had found on the bottom of my shoe. You came to my house expecting a victim. You came expecting a naive, desperate little girl who would cry for her mother's approval. But you made one catastrophic miscalculation. I am not the little girl you abandoned, and I'm about to show you exactly how smart I really am. Desmond slammed his heavy hand down onto the marble coffee table, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot through the room. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He could not handle being outsmarted by the child he had deemed defective. He squared his broad shoulders, puffing out his chest to tower over me desperately, trying to summon the patriarchal authority he used to wield over my life. His neck flushed a deep crimson, and the veins bulged against his tightly buttoned collar. "You shut your mouth and show some respect," Desmond roared, his voice booming with the aggressive entitlement of a man used to absolute obedience. "Uncle Silas is dead. He was a disgrace to this family, a lazy musician who never contributed a single respectable thing to society. That land belongs to the real family. It belongs to the bloodline that actually built a legacy in this city. I am your father. I am the head of this family. I have the right to dictate where those assets go. We need that money to secure our status, to save your sister's clinic, and to maintain our standing in the church. You are going to stop acting like a rebellious, ungrateful teenager and remember your place. The universe is rightfully returning Silas's assets to the true family." I let him scream. I let him exert all his hot, frantic air until his chest heaved and his face dripped with nervous sweat. I looked at the man who shared my DNA, feeling absolutely no connection to him. I looked down at the $50,000 check I was holding between my fingers. With slow, deliberate movements, I ripped the check neatly in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces flutter down onto the hardwood floor right at his polished leather shoes. I looked directly into his eyes, my expression entirely deadpan. "How much did you sell me for when I was 12 years old to pay for Kiara's medical school admission?" The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that sucked the oxygen straight out of the room. Beatrice gasped loudly, taking a stumbling step backward, as if I had physically struck her. Kiara's jaw dropped, her arrogant posture instantly dissolving into rigid shock. Desmond's face morphed from aggressive rage to sheer paralyzed panic. His mouth opened, but the booming, patriarchal voice was completely gone. I did not let them speak. I kept my tone perfectly level, weaponizing the ugly truth they had buried for 18 years. "I know exactly what happened, Desmond." I stated my words, cutting through the air with forensic precision. "I know that when my middle school counselor finally diagnosed my severe dyslexia, they handed you a thick folder of resources. They gave you a list of specialized tutors, private learning centers, and cognitive therapists. I know the exact dollar amount it would have cost to give me the education I desperately needed to function. It was $40,000 a year. But Kiara was already enrolled in an elite pre-med preparatory academy that cost $50,000 a year. You and Beatrice had a very clear choice. You could downgrade your expensive country club memberships, sell one of the luxury vehicles, and afford to educate both of your daughters. Or, you could just get rid of the broken one." Desmond shook his head weakly, raising a trembling hand to stop me, but I stepped closer, forcing him to hold my gaze. "Uncle Silas did not steal me," I continued relentlessly. "You went to his jazz club on a rainy Tuesday night. You begged him to take me. But you did not just ask for a temporary family favor. You legally relinquished your parental rights. You signed full legal guardianship over to a man you openly despised just so you could legally remove me as a financial dependent on your tax returns. You needed to show a higher disposable income to secure the massive loans you took out for Kiara's tuition and for Beatrice's charity galas. You literally traded your 12-year-old daughter for a pristine credit score and a VIP seat at the pastor's table. Beatrice tried to interrupt, her voice shaking violently as she stammered out pathetic excuses. Imani, please, you do not understand how hard it was. Silas offered to help. We thought his home would be the best environment for a child who needed a creative outlet. I turned my cold, unblinking gaze to her, shutting her down instantly. You did not send me to a creative outlet, Beatrice. You threw me away like a defective product because fixing me was too expensive and too embarrassing for your flawless image. You sold my future to fund Kiara's perfection. You signed away your rights to me, which means you legally signed away your rights to ever call yourself my family again. So when Desmond stands in my house and demands that Uncle Silas's wealth belongs to the real family, he is absolutely correct. It belongs to the family Uncle Silas chose. And that family is me. Kiara stepped forward, her hands shaking as she tried to salvage the collapsing narrative. We always loved you, Imani. Silas manipulated you against us. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You missed me. You were the one who packed my belongings into 2 black plastic trash bags. I saw you smiling from your bedroom window when Uncle Silas drove me away. You got your expensive medical degree, Kiara. You got your wealthy, connected husband. You got the flawless golden life because I was sacrificed to pay for it. And now you have squandered every single penny of that bloody privilege. You are standing in my house, drowning in your own debt, begging the sacrifice to save you. Desmond's fists clenched at his sides. He was physically shaking with a terrifying mix of profound shame and absolute wrath. He realized in that agonizing moment that the pristine narrative he had carefully constructed for 18 years was entirely shattered. I was not the slow, ignorant child he could bully into submission. I was the meticulous accountant of their sins, holding the ultimate undeniable ledger of their failures. Connor Kensington decided he had heard enough. Seeing his father-in-law completely neutralized by the harsh light of reality was entirely unacceptable to his ingrained sense of superiority. He stepped smoothly in front of Desmond, physically inserting himself between me and my biological parents. He buttoned his suit jacket with a sharp, practiced flick of his wrists. The terrified, cornered animal I had exposed just moments ago vanished, instantly replaced by the ruthless, entitled heir of the Kensington legacy. If intimidation through family guilt could not break me, he would simply crush me beneath the crushing weight of his generational wealth. Listen very closely to me, Imani. Connor began, his voice dropping into a low, dangerously calm register. He tilted his chin down, looking at me as if I were a speck of dirt that had unfortunately attached itself to his Italian leather shoes. You have had your little moment of dramatic rebellion. You got to spout off your rehearsed real estate trivia and play the role of the vengeful outcast. It was a cute performance. But playtime is officially over. Let me explain exactly how the real world operates, because clearly your little jazz musician uncle never taught you the harsh realities of high finance. He took a slow, calculated step forward, invading my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne was suffocating a heavy cloud of arrogance and unearned power. You think because you identified a few zoning clauses that you actually hold any power in this room? Connor chuckled, a dry, humorless sound meant to belittle me. You are completely delusional. You are playing checkers while the rest of us are playing chess on a board you do not even know exists. You see, $15 million is a lot of money to someone like you. To a slow, struggling girl who has never seen a comma in her bank account, it feels like a lottery ticket. But to the Kensington family, $15 million is a rounding error. It is a rounding error that I am absolutely not going to let you walk away with. I kept my face perfectly impassive, letting him talk, letting him dig the hole deeper. His utter conviction that I was intimidated was almost comical. Let me paint a very clear picture of your immediate future if you refuse to sign that document. Connor continued, raising a hand and ticking off his points on his manicured fingers. The moment I walk out of your front door, I am making a single phone call to my family's corporate legal team. We retain a firm of over 200 ruthless Ivy League-educated attorneys who specialize in hostile acquisitions and asset freezing. They destroy massive corporations before breakfast. What do you think they are going to do to a single uneducated woman with zero financial backing? He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a harsh whisper, ensuring every single word landed like a physical blow. We will tie that land up in litigation for the next decade. We will file injunction after injunction. We will challenge the validity of your uncle's will, claiming he was not of sound mind when he left the property to a dependent with a documented history of cognitive delays. We will subpoena your middle school records, Imani. We will drag your academic failures into a public courtroom and prove to a judge that you do not possess the mental capacity to manage an asset of that magnitude. We will drown you in legal fees so fast you will be selling your clothes just to afford a public defender. Kiara watched her husband with a renewed sense of arrogant pride, her confidence inflating as Connor weaponized his family's influence. Beatrice and Desmond also straightened up, catching the lifeline Connor was throwing them. They loved this. They loved watching the White Knight use his systemic power to put the defective black daughter back in her place. You do not have the stamina for a protracted legal war, Imani. Connor sneered, his blue eyes icy and flat. You do not have the capital, and quite frankly, you are not smart enough to navigate the labyrinth of corporate litigation. You will show up to court completely outmatched, and my lawyers will humiliate you. They will drain every ounce of fight out of you. And when the dust finally settles, the judge will rule in our favor. The state will process the eminent domain payout directly into Kiara's trust, and you will be left with absolutely nothing. Not the land, not the $50,000 I'm offering you right now. You will be left with crippling legal debt and a public record of your incompetence. He paused, letting the devastating threat hang heavily in the air. He was a master of psychological warfare, accustomed to terrifying small business owners and vulnerable individuals into swift submission. He assumed his pedigree alone was enough to make me fold. So I am going to give you one final chance to be reasonable, Connor said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the silver pen once again. He held it out to me, his expression hardening into an absolute command. You are going to tape the pieces of that check back together. You are going to take this pen and you are going to sign the transfer agreement. You will take the $50,000 and consider it an incredibly generous severance package from a family that no longer wishes to deal with your burdensome existence. If you refuse, I will personally guarantee that you spend the rest of your life regretting it. You will lose everything, Imani. Do not mistake my presence here as a negotiation. It is an ultimatum. He stood there holding the pen, a smug, victorious sneer plastered across his face. He truly believed he had won. He believed that the mere mention of the Kensington legal empire was the ultimate trump card. He expected me to reach out with a trembling hand, take the silver pen, and surrender my uncle's legacy to save myself from his fabricated legal apocalypse. He thought I was terrified of his lawyers. I did not take the pen. I did not blink. I simply turned my head slightly, looking past the pathetic, arrogant man standing in front of me, and nodded toward the closed double doors of my home office. Connor caught the direction of my gaze and misinterpreted it completely. He thought my silence was the crushing realization of my own defeat. He assumed I was looking toward the closed doors of my home office because I was searching for an escape route, a place to hide and cry, just like I used to do when I was a child. The arrogant smirk returned to his face, cutting through the sheer panic that had temporarily possessed him. He let out a sharp, condescending breath, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn toddler who had just thrown a meaningless tantrum. He truly believed his threat of unleashing his corporate legal team had broken my spirit. You want to play hardball, Connor said, reaching into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He completely ignored the torn pieces of the $50,000 cashier check resting by his polished leather shoes. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound personal checkbook. He clicked his silver pen with a sharp, metallic snap. I see exactly what is happening here. You ripped up the 50 grand because you figured out the eminent domain valuation and thought you could squeeze us for a little more cash. I get it. You are desperate. You are broke. But you are not smart enough to handle a negotiation at this level, Imani. You are playing a dangerous game with people who own the board. He uncapped the pen and began writing. The sound of the nib scratching aggressively against the thick paper filled the quiet room. He tore the check from the ledger with a swift, dramatic motion and tossed it casually onto the marble coffee table. The slip of paper fluttered through the air and landed right on top of the legal dossier. $100,000, Connor announced, puffing out his chest and adjusting his stance to look as physically imposing as possible. That is my final offer. This is no longer a real estate transaction, Imani. This is a handout. It is a charitable donation from the Kensington estate to keep you off the streets. You are going to take this money, and you are going to be grateful. You can use this massive handout to buy a small, quiet apartment in a neighborhood that actually suits your capabilities. You can get a little job bagging groceries or stocking shelves. You can live out your slow, simple life without ever having to worry about complex financial liabilities or property taxes. He leaned over the table, pressing his knuckles into the marble, trying to force me to look at the check. You are not smart enough to handle a $15 million property. You are too slow to understand the tax implications of a federal payout. If the government handed you that kind of capital, you would be bankrupt in 6 months. You do not understand capital gains. You do not understand wealth management. You are simply not smart enough to handle this. You have always been slow. Everyone in this room knows it. Your parents know it. Your sister knows it. You are a burden. You were a burden at 12 and you are a burden now. Kiara stepped up right beside him, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes flashing with renewed arrogance. Connor is being incredibly generous, she sneered, pointing a manicured finger at the check. That is more money than a slow, defective dropout like you will ever see in a lifetime. You do not deserve $100,000. You do not even deserve a fraction of that. But my husband is a good man. He is stepping up to fix the mess your uncle left behind. Take the handout, Imani. Take it and disappear before he changes his mind and lets his lawyers leave you with absolutely nothing. We are your betters, Imani. Connor continued, his voice dripping with extreme, unadulterated classism. My family has managed generational wealth for over a century. We know how to structure these payouts. We know how to shield these assets from capital gains taxes and federal audits. We are doing the heavy lifting for you. You should be down on your knees thanking us for taking this massive, complicated burden off your shoulders. We are stepping in to manage a situation you are entirely too slow to comprehend. We are the elite class. You are just a slow girl who got lucky with a crazy uncle's will. Take the handout and let your betters take care of the heavy lifting. Beatrice chimed in, perfectly eager to reinforce the psychological abuse. Imani, listen to your brother-in-law, she pleaded, though her voice was sharp and commanding. He is a Kensington. He understands how the real world works. You have always struggled to understand the simplest things. We are trying to protect you from your own glaring incompetence. Take the $100,000. It is a fortune for someone with your limited mental capacity. You will never have to struggle for rent again. Do not be stubborn and ruin this blessing. You are not smart enough to fight us, and you are certainly not smart enough to manage a federal highway buyout. I sat perfectly still, observing the check sitting on the marble table. $100,000. To them, it was an irresistible bribe. To me, it was a glaring, undeniable beacon of their absolute financial desperation. Connor Kensington, the heir to an old money empire, was writing a personal check to secure a $15 million commercial land transfer. He was bypassing escrow. He was bypassing certified bank drafts. He was trying to buy a massive federal payout with a personal piece of paper. It was the sloppiest, most desperate financial maneuver I had ever witnessed in my entire professional career. They were hemorrhaging cash so rapidly they could not even afford to do this legally. They were banking entirely on my supposed stupidity to push this through before their creditors caught up to them. They were calling me slow, repeatedly drilling the word into the air while executing a transaction that any entry-level auditor would immediately flag as fraudulent. The repetition of their insults did not break me. It only proved how utterly oblivious they were to the predator sitting right in front of them. They wanted me to be grateful that my betters were taking care of me. They wanted me to accept their handout and shrink back into the shadows. I looked at the six-figure check, then looked up at Connor's sweating, arrogant face, letting the silence stretch just a little bit longer. Kiara could not handle the silence. My refusal to lunge for the check, my refusal to show a single ounce of gratitude shattered the last remaining fragments of her composure. She shoved past Connor, her designer heels sinking into my imported rug, and slammed her palms down onto the marble table right next to the check. Her flawless, medically enhanced face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. She was no longer just the spoiled golden child. She was a woman backed into a corner, ready to weaponize her societal privilege to destroy her own twin sister. "Listen to me, you ungrateful, slow little burden!" Kiara hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying intensity. "You think you can just sit there and ignore us? You think because you are legally an adult that you actually have autonomy. You do not. You never have. If you do not pick up that pen and sign this contract right now, I am making a phone call that will strip away every single right you think you possess. I will call Adult Protective Services this exact minute." The threat dropped into the room like a lead weight. Julian shifted slightly in his corner, his eyes narrowing, but he held his ground. My in-laws remained perfectly still, radiating silent academic outrage. "I am a board-certified medical doctor." Imani, Kiara continued, her voice rising, dripping with absolute authority. "Do you know what kind of weight an MD carries in the state of Georgia? It means when I sign a sworn medical affidavit stating that my twin sister is suffering from severe undiagnosed cognitive delays that render her mentally unfit to manage her own affairs. The courts will listen to me. I will testify under oath that you have a documented childhood history of severe learning disabilities. I will tell the judge that your dyslexia is actually a profound cognitive deficit and that you are a danger to your own financial and physical well-being." She leaned in closer, her expensive perfume mingling with the scent of spilled tea. The cruelty in her eyes was absolute. "I will tell them you are too slow to function in society," Kiara whispered viciously. "I will pull your miserable middle school transcripts. I will have Mom and Dad testify that they had to give you away because your mental capacity was so degraded that you required constant specialized supervision. The judge will look at my medical license, look at Connor's wealth, look at our parents standing in their Sunday best, and then they will look at you. A slow, uneducated college dropout sitting in an empty house. Who do you think they are going to believe?" Beatrice stepped forward, clasping her hands together in a twisted display of maternal concern. She was entirely on board with this horrific plan. "We are doing this for your own good, Imani," Beatrice chimed in, her voice adopting a sickeningly sweet, placating tone. "You are simply not smart enough to make these decisions. You are a burden to yourself. Kiara is a respected physician. If she says you need psychiatric intervention and a court-appointed conservatorship, the state will grant it. We will have Kiara appointed as your legal guardian. She will have total control over your medical decisions, your living arrangements, and your finances. We will take the land anyway, but if you force us to do it this way, we will make sure you spend the rest of your life locked under our legal control." The sheer scale of their depravity was staggering. They were not just trying to steal $15 million. They were willing to legally erase my humanity. They were fully prepared to perjure themselves in a court of law, abuse a medical license, and weaponize the state apparatus to have me declared mentally incompetent. They wanted to place me in a conservatorship, stripping me of my right to vote, my right to sign contracts, and my right to live independently, all to cover up their own catastrophic financial failures. "You will be treated like a ward of the state," Connor added, crossing his arms and smiling with deep satisfaction. He loved this strategy. It appealed directly to his aristocratic belief that the wealthy could simply buy or legislate their way out of any problem. "Kiara will manage your allowance. She will decide where you live. If you try to fight us, if you try to hire some cheap public defender to challenge the conservatorship, Kiara will just have you committed to a psychiatric facility for an evaluation." A 72-hour involuntary hold is incredibly easy for a licensed doctor to arrange when dealing with a combative, slow family member. They were mapping out my destruction with the casual ease of planning a dinner party. The repetition of their insults continued to strike like a metronome. Slow, burden, defective, not smart enough. They used the words as justification for their violence, convincing themselves that because I was supposedly inferior, I did not deserve basic human rights. I did not break my gaze from Kiara. She was panting slightly, her chest heaving as the adrenaline of her own cruel threat coursed through her veins. She felt incredibly powerful. She felt like a god standing over a peasant. "You are going to take this check," Kiara commanded, jabbing her finger at the piece of paper. "You are going to sign the deed. You are going to thank us for not throwing you into a state-run group home for the mentally deficient. You are going to remember that you are the defective twin, and you are going to obey me. Because if you do not, I will personally make sure you never make another decision for yourself as long as you live. I will crush whatever sad, pathetic little life you have managed to build, and I will do it with a single stroke of my pen." Desmond nodded in firm agreement, stepping up to flank his golden child. "You heard your sister, Imani. Do not force us to destroy you. We do not want to air the family's dirty laundry in court. We do not want the embarrassment of explaining to our congregation that our daughter is a mentally incompetent ward of the state. Just take the $100,000 and sign the paper. We are giving you a way out. Take the money, be a good girl, and disappear." The air in the room was thick with their malice. They had backed me into what they believed was an inescapable corner. They had threatened my freedom, my mind, and my future. They expected me to crumble, to burst into tears, to beg for their mercy, and snatch the pen from the table to save myself from an involuntary psychiatric hold. They waited for the panic to set in. They waited for the slow, burdensome child to finally surrender to her betters. I kept my hands resting gently in my lap. My heartbeat remained perfectly steady. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. I had let them talk. I had let them expose every ounce of their fraud, their extortion, and their willingness to commit medical malpractice and perjury. They had built a beautiful, elaborate trap, completely unaware that they were the ones standing squarely inside it. The silence returned, but this time it belonged entirely to me. I looked at the three of them, these architects of my childhood misery, standing shoulder to shoulder in their desperate greed. They had played their absolute worst cards. They had threatened to institutionalize me simply to steal what was mine. They had proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that they were beyond redemption. My complete lack of a terrified reaction was finally beginning to unnerve Kiara, her arrogant smirk faltering as she stared down at me. Beatrice sensed the shift in the room. She saw her golden child faltering under the weight of my absolute silence, and Connor sweating through his expensive tailored suit. Beatrice was a master manipulator, a woman who had spent decades ruthlessly climbing the social ladder of Atlanta by knowing exactly which pressure points to press. If threatening my freedom and my mind did not break me, she knew she had to target the only thing I actually loved. She adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, her face hardening into a mask of pure, vindictive cruelty. She stepped around the marble coffee table, pushing Connor and Kiara slightly aside, claiming the center stage for herself. "You think you are so brave," Beatrice hissed, her voice dropping into a venomous whisper that carried clearly to every corner of the room. "You think, because Silas shielded you from the real world, that you are untouchable. You loved that eccentric old fool, did you not? You loved him because he was the only person desperate enough to tolerate a slow, defective burden like you. But Silas is dead, Imani. He is dead, and his legacy is entirely at my mercy." I felt a cold prickle of warning at the base of my neck. My hands, which had been resting perfectly relaxed in my lap, twitched. Beatrice saw the tiny movement and smiled. She had found the nerve, and she was about to carve it out with a rusted knife. "If you do not sign that transfer agreement right this second," Beatrice threatened, leaning forward so her shadow fell across the table, "I will destroy every single memory you have of him. You know my position at the megachurch. You know the influence Desmond and I wield over the congregation, the local press, and the community board. Tomorrow morning I will go directly to Pastor Jenkins. I will stand at the pulpit and I will weep. I will tell a tragic, horrifying story about how my vulnerable, mentally deficient daughter was preyed upon by her own uncle. The air in the room turned to ice. Julian's father let out a sharp gasp of absolute disgust, but Beatrice completely ignored him, intoxicated by her own depravity. I will tell them that Silas was a predator. Beatrice continued, her voice gaining a sickening theatrical cadence. I will say he manipulated a slow, learning disabled child to steal her inheritance. I will tell the local news outlets that his entire jazz career was a front for money laundering and grooming. I will paint him as a monster who isolated a mentally incompetent girl from her loving parents just to abuse her. By the time I am finished, radio stations will refuse to play his music. His royalty checks will dry up. His name will become a toxic curse in this city. They will tear down that memorial plaque at the jazz club, and they will spit on his grave. Kiara and Connor looked at Beatrice with a mixture of shock and profound admiration. This was the nuclear option. This was the ultimate blackmail. Desmond puffed out his chest, crossing his arms, completely validating his wife's horrific plan to falsely accuse his own deceased brother of abuse just to secure a real estate payout. You are not smart enough to stop me, Imani, Beatrice sneered, leaning in so close I could smell the sharp chemical tang of her hairspray. You have no platform. You have no voice. You are a dropout. I am a pillar of this community. When I speak, people listen. They will devour a scandal like this because they love watching a supposedly good man fall. I will drag Silas through the mud until there is absolutely nothing left but shame. You will spend the rest of your life knowing that your stubbornness ruined the only man who ever cared about you. Is that what you want? Are you really willing to let Silas burn just to hold on to a piece of dirt you are too slow to manage? She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her voice rising to a triumphant shriek. Sign the paper. Sign it, or I will turn your beloved uncle into the biggest monster this city has ever seen. You were a burden to him in life, Imani. Do not be the reason his legacy is destroyed in death. That was it. That was the final, irreversible crossing of the Rubicon. For 18 years, I had built my empire in total silence. I had constructed my life with meticulous precision, carefully locking away the frightened, dyslexic 12-year-old girl they had thrown away. I had never sought revenge. I had simply wanted to exist far away from their toxic, status-obsessed ecosystem. But in their desperate, scrambling greed to cover up their own financial ruin, they had barged into my sanctuary and threatened the one man who had taught me how to read, how to code, and how to survive. Uncle Silas had spent countless hours sitting with me, teaching me that my brain was not defective but uniquely brilliant. He had saved my life, and Beatrice had just promised to destroy his memory. My perfect, practiced calm completely evaporated. I did not scream. I did not cry. The mask of polite indifference I had worn since they kicked down my door fell away, revealing the cold apex predator I had become. The shift in my demeanor was so sudden, so physically palpable, that Beatrice instinctively took a step back, her triumphant smile freezing on her face. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I stood up. I did not rush. I uncrossed my legs, planted my feet firmly on the imported rug, and rose to my full height. I was suddenly towering over my mother, my sister, and the pathetic men who enabled them. The sheer, overwhelming force of my presence hit them like a tidal wave. I was no longer the slow, quiet child they could bully. I was a completely different species. You should not have said his name, I whispered. My voice was dangerously soft, a lethal razor slicing through the heavy tension of the living room. You should have taken your fake check and walked out of my house. You should have focused on saving yourselves. But you just had to threaten Silas. Connor tried to step forward to regain control, opening his mouth to issue another legal threat. But the look I shot him stopped him dead in his tracks. He physically froze, his aristocratic arrogance evaporating under the weight of my stare. You think I am a burden? I continued, my voice echoing off the high ceilings with terrifying clarity. You think I am slow. You think you can waltz into my home, wave a fraudulent contract in my face, threaten me with a psychiatric hold, and blackmail me with fabricated allegations of abuse. You think you hold all the cards because you possess a country club membership and a medical license. I picked up the $100,000 check from the table. I did not tear it. I held it up, displaying it to all of them. You came here looking for a vulnerable target to fund your salvation, I said, locking eyes with Beatrice, who was now trembling visibly. You thought you were playing chess against a defective child. But you just walked blindfolded into a minefield, and you have no idea that I am the one holding the detonator. I turned my head toward the closed double doors of my home office at the far end of the grand living room. It was time. Julian, I called out, my voice ringing with absolute unbreakable authority. We are done playing with them. Bring out the Vanguard files. The heavy mahogany doors of my home office unlatched with a sharp, echoing click. The trap was officially sprung, and my family was about to learn exactly what happens when you try to bury someone who has already conquered the underworld. Julian, who had remained a silent, observant sentinel in the corner of our grand living room, finally moved. He gave his parents a reassuring glance before stepping smoothly across the imported rug. He did not rush. He moved with the terrifying, calculated grace of a man who held the executioner's axe and was in absolutely no hurry to swing it. He reached the heavy mahogany doors of my home office just as they unlatched from the inside. The doors swung inward, revealing the expansive state of the art command center I had built from the ground up. Stepping out from the shadows of the office were two of my senior associates. They wore immaculate dark charcoal suits, their expressions entirely devoid of emotion. They looked like undertakers arriving to collect a body. Each of them carried a heavy, reinforced steel briefcase, securely handcuffed to their wrists. They moved in perfect synchronization, stepping into the living room and flanking Julian. The sheer cinematic weight of their entrance hit my biological family like a physical shockwave. Beatrice instinctively backed away, her hands flying up to clutch the pearls at her neck. Desmond blinked rapidly, his aggressive posture collapsing as he tried to comprehend the sudden shift in the atmosphere. They had expected a weeping, broken woman surrendering to their demands. They had completely failed to anticipate a coordinated corporate strike team operating out of my supposedly empty rental house. Kiara grabbed Connor's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "What is this?" Kiara demanded, her voice wavering dangerously between fake bravado and genuine panic. "Who are these people, Imani? I told you not to play games with us. Are these your little roommates? Did you hire actors to try and scare us?" Julian ignored her. He stepped up to the marble coffee table towering over the torn pieces of the $50,000 cashier check and the fraudulent legal dossier. The two associates stepped forward in unison. They placed the reinforced steel briefcases directly onto the marble surface, completely ignoring the delicate porcelain tea service. The simultaneous, heavy metallic clicks of the briefcase locks disengaging echoed sharply in the silent room. It sounded like the cocking of a loaded weapon. Julian buttoned his suit jacket, fixing his gaze directly on Desmond and Beatrice. When he finally spoke, his voice was a masterclass in lethal politeness. It was the calm, measured tone of a predator who had already won the hunt and was simply deciding which piece to devour first. "Good afternoon, Julian," said his words, slicing effortlessly through the tension. "Allow me to formally introduce myself, since you were entirely too preoccupied with insulting my wife to ask for my name. I am Julian. I am Imani's husband. But for the context of this specific conversation, my marital status is the least important of my credentials." He paused, letting his eyes sweep over the four intruders, ensuring every single one of them was hanging on his next breath. "Prior to entering this private sector, I spent 8 years serving as an assistant United States attorney for the Northern District of Georgia." Julian continued, his voice perfectly level. "I specialized in white-collar crime, federal wire fraud, and complex financial racketeering. I spent the better part of a decade putting arrogant, wealthy men who thought they were above the law into federal penitentiaries." Desmond visibly swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing erratically in his throat. The mention of federal prosecutors instantly stripped away his country club courage. Beatrice looked as though the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath her. But Connor, clinging desperately to his generational wealth, tried to mount one last pathetic defense. You think you can intimidate me with a former government employee? Connor scoffed, though his voice lacked its previous booming authority. He was sweating profusely now. I already told you my family retains an army of corporate litigators. We eat former public servants for breakfast. Whatever little local practice you run now is nothing compared to the Kensington legal empire. Julian smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant smile. I am fully aware of the Kensington legal empire, Connor. Julian replied, stepping closer until he was mere inches from my brother-in-law. I know exactly who represents you. In fact, I spoke with your lead counsel, Richard Sterling, at 7 o'clock yesterday evening. He is a very pragmatic man, a man who desperately values discretion. Connor's arrogant sneer completely vanished. The mention of his lead counsel's specific name was a precision strike. His eyes darted to the locked briefcases, a sudden paralyzing realization beginning to dawn on him. You see, Julian continued gesturing to the associates, who were now opening the briefcases. I left the public sector to take on a far more lucrative role. I am currently the Chief Legal Officer of Vanguard Forensic Partners. We are an elite crisis management and forensic accounting firm. We specialize in untangling massive corporate fraud, tracing hidden offshore assets, and auditing deeply compromised financial institutions. The name dropped into the room like an active grenade. Vanguard Forensic Partners. Connor physically staggered backward, bumping into Kiara. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. He knew that name. Every elite, desperate billionaire drowning in illicit debt knew that name. It was the firm you called when the federal government was closing in, and you needed to know exactly how much jail time you were facing. It was the firm that currently held the absolute fate of the Kensington Family Trust in its hands. And those 200 ruthless Ivy League-educated attorneys you keep threatening my wife with. Julian added, his tone conversational but dripping with absolute dominance. They are not going to save you today, Connor. Do you want to know why? Because they are the exact people who hired my firm. Yesterday morning, Richard Sterling authorized a highly confidential $2 million retainer to secure Vanguard services. He hired us to conduct a total shadow audit of your family's collapsing portfolios. We have full, unrestricted access to every single ledger, every offshore shell company, and every heavily leveraged real estate asset your family possesses. The associates simultaneously flipped open the lids of the steel briefcases. Inside, stacked in meticulous, terrifying order, were dozens of bright red folders. These were not generic legal documents. These were the forensic autopsy reports of Connor's entire financial existence. Kiara stared at the briefcases, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. She looked at Julian, then at the suited associates, and finally back at me. The narrative that I was a slow, burdensome dropout was disintegrating right before her eyes, replaced by a reality far more terrifying. Julian stepped back to my side, presenting a united, impenetrable front. He gestured gracefully toward the open briefcases on the table. My husband had just systematically neutralized the only weapon Connor Kensington possessed, entirely stripping away his generational armor. My family had barged into my home expecting an easy victim. Instead, they were staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar corporate tribunal orchestrated by the very firm holding their darkest secrets. I walked slowly back to the marble coffee table. The air in the room was absolutely motionless, thick with the suffocating realization of their impending doom. I reached down and picked up the personal check Connor had just tossed at me, the $100,000 lifeline he genuinely believed would buy my compliance. I did not tear it in half like I had with the cashier check. Instead, I turned and walked toward a sleek, matte black console resting beneath a massive custom mirror against the far wall of my living room. I pressed a hidden touch sensor on the console. A mechanized commercial paper shredder seamlessly built into the cabinetry whirred to life with a quiet, incredibly efficient hum. I dropped Connor's check into the narrow slot. The machine instantly devoured it, pulling the heavy paper down and turning his arrogant, desperate handout into worthless confetti in a matter of seconds. I picked up a small, minimalist smart remote resting next to the shredder. I pressed a single button. The automated blinds over my floor-to-ceiling windows smoothly descended, plunging the grand living room into a theater-like darkness. The massive mirror above the console instantly transitioned, illuminating the room as a state-of-the-art high-definition projection screen. The sudden crisp blue light cast sharp, cold shadows across the terrified faces of my biological family. I turned to face them, the glowing screen behind me, displaying a dizzying, intricate web of financial algorithms, banking codes, and offshore routing matrices. For 18 years, I began my voice ringing with absolute, unbreakable clarity. You told yourselves a very specific story so you could sleep better at night. You told everyone at your elite country club and your mega church that I was hopelessly defective. You called me slow. You called me a burden. You convinced yourselves that my brain was completely broken because I could not read a standard history textbook the way your perfect golden child could. You weaponized the word slow, using it to justify throwing away your own flesh and blood. I pointed to the screen behind me where cascading lines of code shifted and reorganized themselves into flawless, symmetrical patterns. But Uncle Silas did not look at me and see a burden. I continued my gaze, locking onto Beatrice, who was physically trembling in her designer suit. When you dumped me at his door like unwanted garbage, he actually sat down and paid attention. He realized that my brain did not process language linearly. Words on a page twisted and swam for me because my mind was not meant to read them the way yours does. Silas was a master jazz musician. He understood improvisation. He understood that sometimes true brilliance lies entirely in the notes you do not play. He recognized that my severe dyslexia was not a cognitive deficit at all. It was a highly advanced neurological adaptation. Kiara stared at me, her mouth slightly open, the arrogant sneer completely wiped from her face. I took a slow step toward her. Silas translated sheet music into mathematical equations, and then translated those equations into binary code, I explained, laying bare the foundation of my empire. While you were sitting around dinner tables calling me not smart enough to function in basic society, Silas was teaching me how to read the underlying matrix of the global economy. My brain naturally processes numerical patterns, corporate discrepancies, and hidden data streams in 3 dimensions. I see the invisible microscopic threads connecting offshore accounts, fraudulent shell companies, and falsified tax returns. The exact neurodivergence you labeled as slow and defective turned me into an absolute prodigy in forensic accounting and crisis management. Julian remained standing near the open doors of my office, a look of profound, unwavering pride on his face. His parents, who had watched this entire confrontation unfold with dignified restraint, exchanged a look of deep vindication. They knew my history. They knew the agonizing nights I had spent unlearning the toxic shame my biological parents had branded into my psyche. They knew exactly how hard I had worked to turn the label of defective into an unstoppable weaponized intellect. Seeing the architects of my childhood trauma finally confronted with the undeniable reality of my brilliance was a moment of absolute poetic justice. I gestured expansively to the glowing projection. "I do not just understand high finance, Connor," I said, shifting my cold stare to my sweating brother-in-law. "I dissect it. I completely dismantle it. I founded Vanguard Forensic Partners when I was 24 years old. I built an elite multi-million-dollar corporate intelligence firm from the absolute ground up because I possessed the exact cognitive processing power you mocked. Linear thinkers like those Ivy League lawyers you threatened me with look at a cooked financial ledger and see perfectly balanced books. I look at a cooked ledger and see the exact millisecond a desperate billionaire decides to commit federal wire fraud." Desmond gripped the back of an armchair, looking as though his legs might give out at any moment. He was finally grasping the catastrophic magnitude of their mistake. "You threw me away because I was not smart enough to memorize spelling words," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, deadly calm. "You sacrificed me so Kiara could memorize medical textbooks and buy you a front-row seat to high society. But the real world does not run on flashcards and social climbing, Desmond. The real world runs on capital extreme leverage and raw data, and I control the data. I see every single hidden transaction. I see every pathetic lie you tell yourselves to feel superior. You operated under the fatal assumption that intelligence only looks one way. I continued pacing slowly in front of the illuminated data streams. You believed that because I could not conform to your rigid superficial metric of success, I was inherently worthless. You needed me to be slow so you could feel fast. You needed me to be a burden so you could play the roles of the flawless, unencumbered elite. But while you were busy maintaining an illusion of wealth, I was mastering the architecture of actual power. I built a company that untangles the darkest, most convoluted corporate conspiracies on the planet. I sit in boardrooms with chief executive officers and international regulators, and they pay me exorbitant sums of money precisely because my brain sees the anomalies that their standardized traditional minds completely overlook. I stepped right up to the coffee table, leaning over the scattered remnants of their fraudulent legal dossier. You thought you could walk into my home and overwhelm a slow, uneducated girl, I stated, driving the final nail into the coffin of their arrogance. But you walked blindly into the home of the very apex predator hired to track your financial bleeding. You called me a burden, but the only burden in this room is the crushing, inescapable weight of your own federal crimes. My non-linear thinking allowed me to track every single penny Connor embezzled from the Kensington Trust. It allowed me to trace every single fraudulent Medicare claim Kiara submitted to fund her extravagant lifestyle. I saw the patterns you thought were perfectly hidden. I cracked the codes your expensive accountants thought were secure. I mapped the entire undeniable anatomy of your destruction, and I did it all with the very brain you told me was completely worthless. I pressed the silver button on my smart remote one more time. The dizzying matrix of numerical data on the projection screen dissolved, wiping away the cascading codes to reveal a single stark image. A massive, imposing corporate logo materialized against the solid black background of the glass. It was a stylized geometric shield intertwined with a sharp V rendered in a cold, brushed steel gray. Below it, in crisp, authoritative typography, read the words Vanguard Forensic Partners. The breath physically hitched in Connor's throat. He recognized that logo. Every elite, heavily leveraged family on the eastern seaboard who was secretly drowning in financial scandal recognized that logo. It was the digital seal of the Grim Reaper of high finance. He took a stumbling step backward, his polished leather shoes scraping loudly against the marble floor as if trying to physically distance himself from the screen. I did not just start a boutique accounting firm. I explained, my voice echoing through the grand living room with surgical precision. I built a global crisis management syndicate. We do not do tax returns or run standard payroll. We do disaster mitigation for the 1%. When a generational wealth trust realizes they are hemorrhaging hundreds of millions of dollars into thin air, they do not call the police. They call my secure hotline. When an international conglomerate faces a hostile takeover because their chief financial officer has been running a shadow ledger, they beg for my intervention. I am the apex predator the elite class hires when they are terrified of going to federal prison. I clicked the remote again. The logo shrank to the upper corner, making way for a high-definition scan of a deeply confidential legal document. It was a retainer agreement dated exactly 24 hours ago. At the very bottom of the page, beneath the densely packed terms of service and severe non-disclosure clauses, was a bold, looping signature. Connor swayed, bracing his hand heavily against the edge of the velvet sofa to keep from collapsing to his knees. He knew that signature intimately. It belonged to Richard Sterling, the legendary ruthless lead counsel of the Kensington estate. The very man Connor had just threatened to unleash upon me to crush my spirit. Yesterday morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, Richard Sterling wired a non-refundable retainer fee of $2 million into Vanguard's corporate holding account. I stated, ensuring every single syllable landed like a physical blow to his chest. He did not negotiate the price. He did not ask for a payment plan. He paid the $2 million instantly because the Kensington Family Trust is facing an apocalyptic liquidity crisis. He hired my firm to conduct a total unrestricted shadow audit of your entire familial portfolio. Connor shook his head in violent, rapid movements, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked from the glowing screen to me, then back to the screen, entirely unable to reconcile the undeniable reality of the document with the prejudiced fiction he had clung to for so long. His generational armor was cracking, fragmenting into worthless pieces on my living room floor. "You walked into my home and offered me a personal check for $100,000, I said, allowing a cold, mocking smile to touch my lips. You threw it on my table like a benevolent king, tossing a gold coin to a filthy beggar. You thought you were displaying immense wealth. You thought you were intimidating me with your old money pedigree. But you do not even realize that your family's lead counsel just wired my company 20 times that amount just to secure my signature on a confidentiality agreement. I made $2 million off your family's sheer desperation before I even finished my morning coffee." Beatrice and Desmond stood completely paralyzed. The immense scale of the wealth and power I was casually describing was entirely beyond their comprehension. They had spent their entire lives scrambling for social scraps, groveling for a seat at the pastor's table, or a discounted membership at the local country club. They were absolutely terrified of Connor's status and his family's reputation. And now they were watching Connor, their prized son-in-law, realize that his family's survival rested entirely in the palm of my hand. Richard Sterling came to Vanguard because the Kensington Trust is bleeding out. I continued pacing slowly toward Connor, trapping him firmly under my unwavering gaze. He knows that someone inside the family is siphoning capital. He knows the internal ledgers are cooked, but your family's traditional accountants are too slow, too archaic, and too terrified of your father to find the leak. So they came to the best. They came to the firm that specializes in hunting down financial parasites. Richard gave my team total, unfettered access to every single encrypted server, offshore account, and shell company the Kensingtons possess. I stepped within breathing distance of Connor. He smelled of cold sweat, expensive cologne, and absolute terror. His chest heaved erratically. "You told me I was not smart enough to understand high finance," I whispered, my tone laced with lethal irony. "You told me I did not comprehend complex liabilities. You threatened to subpoena my middle school records to prove I was mentally incompetent. But while you were busy rehearsing your pathetic little threats and insulting my intelligence, my team of data analysts was already tearing through your family's most heavily guarded financial secrets." I clicked the remote one final time. The screen shifted from the retainer agreement to a massive, complex wireframe graphic. It was a digital map of the Kensington family's entire wealth distribution network. Bright red warning lights pulsed aggressively across several key nodes, indicating massive, catastrophic irregularities and illicit fund transfers. "I literally hold your family's financial survival in my hands, Connor," I said, my voice carrying the lethal weight of absolute authority. "I am the one who decides what gets buried and what gets handed over to the Securities and Exchange Commission. You barged into the home of the one person on this earth who holds the detonator to your entire legacy. You thought you were dealing with a slow, defective child who would bow to your demands. But you are dealing with the CEO of Vanguard Forensic Partners. And your heavily redacted file is sitting right next on my desk." I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the associate standing to my left. He stepped forward with military precision, bypassing the spilled tea and the shredded remains of Connor's pathetic check. From his locked steel briefcase, he withdrew a single heavy red folder. He set it down on the marble coffee table and slid it smoothly across the polished surface until it came to a halt, exactly 1 inch from Connor's belt buckle. The bold black lettering on the cover simply read, "Kensington Primary Audit, unredacted." Connor stared down at the red folder as if it were a venomous snake coiled to strike. The suffocating arrogance that had practically radiated from his pores just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by the primal, paralyzing terror of a man who suddenly realizes he is standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. "Open it, Connor," I commanded. My voice did not rise. It remained perfectly cold and absolute, vibrating with the authority of an executioner. "You wanted to lecture me about the harsh realities of high finance. You wanted to play the role of the benevolent aristocrat. offering a handout to the slow, incompetent girl. So open the file. Let us take a very close look at your financial genius. His hand trembled violently as he reached for the cover. He tried to mask the shaking, trying to grip the edge of the cardboard with a firm hold, but his motor skills were failing him under the crushing weight of the adrenaline flooding his system. He flipped the cover open. His eyes darted across the top page, locking onto the highlighted spreadsheets, the undeniable routing numbers, and the precise damning timestamps of his own illicit transactions. A sharp, ragged gasp tore from his throat. The folder nearly slipped from his fingers. He looked at the numbers, and the absolute destruction of his elite facade was instantaneous. He was not looking at a standard tax audit. He was looking at a federal indictment wrapped in a red cover. You told Kiara your trust fund was temporarily frozen due to a standard compliance issue, I stated, stepping around the coffee table to stand directly in his line of sight. You told my parents you were just waiting on a minor liquidity transfer, but that was a spectacular lie, was it not? Your primary trust fund is not frozen, Connor. It is completely empty. You drained every single cent of your generational inheritance 22 months ago. Kiara let out a choked, high-pitched sound, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at her husband in sheer disbelief. Connor could not even look at her. His eyes remained glued to the pages in front of him, his chest heaving, as if the oxygen in my living room had turned to lead. But losing your own trust fund was not enough. I continued my words, striking him like physical blows. You could not stop there. You needed to maintain the illusion of the Kensington Empire. So you started dipping into the primary corporate accounts. You set up 3 offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. You routed the transfers through Apex Holdings, LLC, hiding the embezzlement behind a labyrinth of fabricated consulting fees and ghost vendor invoices. You thought your digital paper trail was incredibly sophisticated. You thought shifting the funds through 12 different international nodes would make the theft untraceable. I leaned in slightly, making sure he felt the full suffocating weight of my gaze. But you see, Connor, to a brain that processes numerical data non-linearly, your elaborate, sophisticated cover-up looked like a straight, brightly illuminated line pointing directly to your own guilt. You stole $28 million from your father and your grandfather. You embezzled from your own family's firm, committing massive, repeated acts of federal wire fraud. Connor's knees physically buckled. He dropped heavily onto the edge of my velvet sofa, the red folder clutched in his shaking hands. The documents rattled loudly in the silent room. Desmond and Beatrice backed away from him, as if he had suddenly contracted a highly contagious disease. The white knight they had worshipped, the flawless prize they had used to elevate their social status, was a broke, desperate thief. And what did you do with all that stolen capital, I asked, driving the blade deeper. You did not invest it. You did not expand the family business. You wired it directly to high-stakes underground baccarat tables in Macau and illicit sports betting syndicates in Monaco. You are a degenerate gambler masquerading as a financial titan. You lost $28 million of stolen money, and your creditors are finally calling in your debts. That is why you were so desperate to steal Uncle Silas's land. That $15 million eminent domain payout was never going into a trust for Kiara's clinic. It was a frantic last-ditch effort to pay off your margin calls before your father's accountants realized the corporate vaults were empty. Connor buried his face in his free hand, letting out a pathetic, broken sob. The mighty Kensington heir was crying on my living room floor, utterly dismantled by the very person he had just threatened to destroy. You stood in my home, I said, my voice dripping with absolute lethal contempt. You stood in my home and told me I was not smart enough to understand property taxes. You told me I was too slow to grasp capital gains. You threatened to subpoena my middle school records to prove I was mentally incompetent. You tossed a worthless personal check on my table written from a bank account that is currently overdrawn by $7 million and told me to be grateful that my betters were taking care of me. I pointed to the trembling man sitting on my sofa. Look at yourself, Connor. Look at the absolute wreckage of your life. Which one of us is actually too slow to understand high finance? Which one of us is legally incompetent? I built an empire that your family had to pay $2 million just to access. You destroyed a century of generational wealth because you could not walk away from a card table. If my associates hand that red folder over to the Securities and Exchange Commission, you will not just face civil litigation from your own father. You will face a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary for aggravated embezzlement and wire fraud. Your old money pedigree will not save you. The Ivy League lawyers will not save you. You are going to lose your freedom, your name, and every single ounce of the privilege you just tried to weaponize against me. Kiara stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently as she snatched the red folder right out of her husband's grasp. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the undeniable bank statements, the routing codes, and the catastrophic negative balances. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a freight train. She was not married to a billionaire. She was married to a destitute felon who had just dragged her into the center of a federal financial conspiracy. The flawless golden life she had relentlessly rubbed in my face was nothing but a fragile, terrifying house of cards, and I had just set the entire thing ablaze. Kiara dropped the red folder onto the marble table as if the cardboard itself had physically burned her hands. She stumbled backward, her designer heels scraping awkwardly against the expensive rug. She looked at Connor with an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in immediately. She was the golden child. She was programmed by our parents to survive at all costs, even if it meant stepping directly over her own husband's sinking body to save herself. I did not know, Kiara gasped, turning her frantic eyes toward Beatrice and Desmond, desperately seeking their maternal and paternal protection. I had no idea he was stealing. He lied to me. He managed all the accounts. You cannot blame me for his catastrophic failures. I am a victim here. I am a respected doctor. I built my clinic with my own 2 hands. I am still the success story of this family. I am still perfect. I did not let her finish her pathetic, desperate monologue. I simply turned my head and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the second associate standing to my right. He stepped forward with the same terrifying, synchronized precision as his partner. He unlatched his steel briefcase, the heavy metallic click slicing through Kiara's frantic excuses. He reached inside and withdrew a second folder. This one was pristine, stark white, and incredibly thick. He placed it onto the marble coffee table and slid it smoothly across the surface. It came to a complete halt right beside Connor's red folder, resting exactly in front of Kiara. The bold black lettering on the cover read, Buckhead Dermatology and Wellness Unredacted. Kiara stared at the white folder. The frantic defensive energy drained from her body, replaced by a sudden rigid paralysis. She did not reach for it. She did not even seem to breathe. I pressed the button on my smart remote. The projection screen behind me instantly shifted. The sprawling, complex wireframe of Connor's offshore bank accounts dissolved into a completely different kind of digital matrix. The screen flooded with thousands of medical billing codes, insurance claim routing numbers, and patient intake logs. You had to be perfect, I said, my voice echoing with a cold, relentless rhythm. You had to be the golden child. You had to maintain the flawless image at all costs. But Botox injections and chemical peels for wealthy housewives do not generate enough liquid capital to cover the aggressive interest rates on Connor's massive gambling debts. You were bleeding cash, Kiara. You were drowning. You had to keep up appearances. So you decided to get incredibly creative with your accounting. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. She physically shrank away from me, her back pressing hard against the armrest of the velvet sofa. You threatened to use your medical license to destroy my life just 10 minutes ago. I reminded her, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, which only made it infinitely more terrifying. You threatened to commit perjury and abuse your medical authority to have me locked in a psychiatric facility. You felt so incredibly powerful wielding that medical license against the sister you deemed defective. Let us take a very close look at exactly how you have been using it. I clicked the remote again. A specific, highly detailed spreadsheet expanded on the massive screen. Rows upon rows of red highlighted transactions illuminated the dark room. Your luxury spa caters almost exclusively to the private pay elite, I explained. dissecting her entire professional existence with surgical precision. But my forensic software caught a fascinating catastrophic anomaly. Over the last 18 months, your clinic began submitting a massive, unprecedented volume of claims to federal healthcare programs. You started billing Medicare and Medicaid for incredibly complex, medically necessary reconstructive surgeries. Desmond let out a sharp, ragged breath. He was a businessman. He knew exactly what those words meant. He knew the federal government did not play games with Medicare fraud. You were performing basic out-of-pocket cosmetic microdermabrasion on your wealthy clients. I continued, my voice striking like a hammer hitting an anvil. But you were taking their information, falsifying their medical charts, and billing the federal government for stage 3 melanoma excisions. You were upcharging routine skin tags as severe malignant tumor removals. You created phantom patients. You fabricated entire surgical procedures. You manipulated the federal billing matrix because you thought the bureaucracy was too massive and too slow to catch a prestigious, respectability-obsessed doctor operating out of Buckhead. Kiara was physically shaking now. Her pristine, arrogant facade was entirely gone. She looked like a terrified, trapped child who had just been caught setting the house on fire. $4.2 million, I announced, letting the massive, undeniable number hang heavily in the air. That is the exact amount of federal funds you systematically stole over the last 18 months. You siphoned $4.2 million of taxpayer money directly into your clinic's operating account, and then you immediately funneled it through Apex Holdings to cover the margin calls on Connor's gambling debts. You are not a victim of your husband's financial crimes, Kiara. You are an active, willing co-conspirator. You are a federal criminal. Beatrice grabbed the edge of the console table, her legs finally giving out. She slid down, dropping heavily to her knees on the imported rug. Her designer hat tilted awkwardly, her perfect hair coming undone. The reality was utterly destroying her. Her entire identity, her entire social standing in the church and the country club was built exclusively on Kiara's flawless reputation. And I had just revealed that her perfect golden daughter was a thief who stole from the federal government. You told me I was slow, I said, looking down at Kiara, weaponizing the very word she had used to abuse me for decades. You told me I was a burden. You told me I was not smart enough to read the fine print. You called me defective. But the defective child knows exactly how to read a billing ledger. The defective child knows that a single practitioner cannot physically perform 42 complex reconstructive surgeries in a single 48-hour window. The defective child sees the massive, glaring digital footprints you thought you brilliantly buried. You called me slow. You called me defective. But the defective child caught you. Julian stepped forward, perfectly timing his entrance to deliver the legal death blow. Medicare fraud of this magnitude carries severe mandatory minimum sentences. Julian stated, his former prosecutor voice cutting through the room with absolute authority. It triggers immediate asset forfeiture. It guarantees the permanent revocation of your medical license. The federal government will seize your clinic. They will seize your home. They will seize the luxury cars you proudly paraded outside our gates today. And when the Department of Justice unseals this indictment, you will not just lose your wealth. You will face a minimum of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Kiara let out a raw, guttural sob. She collapsed onto the sofa right next to her trembling husband. The two of them sat there, completely broken, entirely dismantled by the precise, unrelenting force of my intellect. They had barged into my home, expecting to conquer a slow, easily manipulated victim. Instead, they had handed me the exact tools I needed to legally and permanently obliterate their entire existence. The absolute obliteration of their shared reality did not bring Connor and Kiara closer together. In the face of a looming federal indictment, the vows of their pristine high society marriage instantly dissolved into a toxic, feral scramble for survival. The ecosystem of narcissism and greed they had built their entire lives upon was rapidly imploding, and I had a front row seat to the carnage. Connor was the first to snap. The aristocratic composure he had spent a lifetime cultivating shattered completely. He sprang up from the velvet sofa, his face contorted in a mask of ugly, desperate fury. He did not look at me. He turned his blazing, bloodshot eyes entirely onto his wife. "You did this!" Connor screamed, his voice cracking with panic as he pointed a trembling finger directly at Kiara. "You bled me dry. You and your endless pathetic need to pretend you were born into my tax bracket. You drained my accounts to buy your designer bags, to fund your country club lunches, to lease those luxury cars just so you could parade around Atlanta like you were royalty. You are nothing but a desperate social climbing gold digger. You dragged me into this. You forced me to find the capital to maintain your ridiculous, fraudulent lifestyle." Kiara gasped, recoiling as if he had physically struck her. The golden child, who had never faced a single consequence in her entire pampered existence, was suddenly being thrown directly under the wheels of a speeding bus by her own white knight. "I forced you!" Kiara shrieked, scrambling up from the sofa, her voice hitting a hysterical, ear-piercing pitch. "You degenerate thief! You lost $28 million at the baccarat tables. I committed federal fraud to save you from your own father. I risked my medical license to cover your margin calls. I kept the creditors from breaking your legs. I kept this family afloat while you drank and gambled your trust fund into an empty, pathetic black hole. Do not you dare blame my lifestyle for your catastrophic stupidity." Connor lunged forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "I will testify against you," he roared, completely abandoning any remaining shred of loyalty. "I will go straight to the Department of Justice tomorrow morning. I will tell the federal prosecutors that you orchestrated the entire Medicare scam. I will tell them you manipulated the accounting software. I will cut a plea deal, and I will gladly let you rot in a federal penitentiary to save myself. You are the doctor. You signed the medical charts. You are the one going to prison, Kiara, not me. I am a Kensington. We do not go to prison for people like you." Kiara let out a raw, guttural scream of absolute terror. The reality of Connor's betrayal hit her with devastating force. She knew he was telling the truth. She knew his family would spend millions to paint her as the mastermind, the greedy outsider who corrupted their precious son. She was entirely alone. She spun around, her eyes wide and frantic, searching desperately for the ultimate safety net she had always relied upon. She looked at Beatrice and Desmond. Her parents. The people who had sacrificed me, their defective twin, to ensure her flawless success. She fell to her knees on the imported rug, crawling toward them. Her expensive silk blouse wrinkled her perfect hair in disarray. "Mom, Dad, please!" Kiara begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. "You have to help me. You have to fix this. Call the lawyers. Sell the house. Do something. He is going to send me to federal prison. I am your golden child. I am your perfect daughter. You cannot let them do this to me. Please, Mommy, please save me." But Beatrice and Desmond did not rush forward to embrace their weeping daughter. They did not wrap their arms around her and promise to make the bad men go away. Instead, they took a simultaneous, horrified step backward. Desmond stared at his hands, his eyes widening in a sudden catastrophic realization. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen pallor. He looked at Beatrice, his breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. "The clinic," Desmond whispered, his voice trembling so violently the words barely formed. Beatrice, the clinic's corporate registration. When Kiara applied for that massive commercial expansion loan last year, her credit was overextended. She needed a guarantor. She needed a corporate board member with unblemished credit to sign the federal tax documents. Beatrice let out a high-pitched, strangled squeak. She pressed both hands against her mouth, her eyes bulging with sheer, unadulterated horror. She was connecting the dots, and the picture it formed was an absolute nightmare. "My name is on the board of directors," Desmond gasped, staggering backward until his back hit the wall. "I signed the financial disclosures. I am legally listed as a primary guarantor for Buckhead Dermatology and Wellness. If the federal government audits that clinic for Medicare fraud, they are going to audit the entire board. They are going to audit my personal finances. They are going to audit the accounts we use to fund the church." Beatrice began to hyperventilate. Her obsession with respectability politics, her desperate need to be the flawless philanthropic queen of her megachurch, instantly morphed into a blinding, paralyzing panic. She realized that the thousands of dollars Kiara had donated to the church building fund, the money Beatrice had proudly presented to the pastor to secure their front row VIP seating, was dirty money. It was stolen federal funds. "The FBI is going to come to the house!" Beatrice cried, her voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "They are going to come to the country club. They will show up at Sunday service. They will march right down the center aisle and put us in handcuffs in front of the entire congregation. Everyone will see. The pastor will see. The entire neighborhood will see us dragged out in our Sunday clothes. We will be ruined. We will be absolutely ruined." Kiara reached out, grasping the hem of Desmond's tailored trousers. "Dad, please." She sobbed, completely broken. "I did it for us. I did it to keep the family looking perfect." Desmond violently yanked his leg away, kicking Kiara's hand off his trousers as if she were a venomous insect. He looked down at his golden child with absolute undisguised terror and profound disgust. "Do not touch me!" Desmond shouted, backing further away from his weeping daughter. "You lied to us. You told us your business was thriving. You linked my pristine financial record to a federal crime. You have destroyed our reputation. You have destroyed everything we built. We cannot help you, Kiara. We cannot be associated with a federal criminal. We have to protect ourselves. We have to protect the family name." Beatrice nodded frantically, her hands shaking as she clutched her designer purse tightly against her chest. She looked down at Kiara, the daughter she had worshipped, the daughter she had sacrificed me for, and she completely severed the tie without a second thought. "Your father is right," Beatrice stammered, stepping away from the grasping hands of her favorite child. "We did not know anything about this. We are innocent. We are upstanding members of the community. If you committed fraud, that is your cross to bear. You cannot drag us down with you. You cannot ruin my standing in the church. We will not go to prison for your mistakes." The implosion was absolute. The toxic ecosystem had completely collapsed. The people who had thrown me away because I was a burden were now looking at their perfect golden child and realizing she was the heaviest, most dangerous burden they had ever encountered. They were turning on each other, tearing each other to pieces, sacrificing their own flesh and blood to save their precious social status. They had built a beautiful, flawless castle on a foundation of lies, and now they were all desperately scrambling to escape the collapsing rubble. The frantic, vicious screaming slowly died down, replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of four completely broken people. The reality of their inescapable doom finally settled over them, suffocating and absolute. Desmond was the first to realize that turning on each other would not stop the federal indictments. Tearing Kiara apart would not erase his signature from the guarantor documents. There was only one person in the room with the power to alter their fate. Desmond slowly turned his head, his wide, bloodshot eyes locking onto me. He looked at the two stark folders resting on the marble coffee table. He looked at the glowing projection screen displaying their financial ruin. And then he looked at the daughter he had thrown away. "Imani," Desmond whispered, his voice shaking with a sudden, desperate reverence. He took a hesitant step toward me, holding his hands out with his palms facing upward in a gesture of total surrender. "Imani, you are the chief executive officer. You own Vanguard. You control the software. You control the data. You are the one who submits the final audit to Richard Sterling and the federal regulators." Connor stopped hyperventilating. His head snapped up. The realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. He scrambled up from the sofa, stumbling over his own feet as he rushed toward the coffee table. He did not care about his tailored suit or his aristocratic dignity anymore. He practically threw himself onto his knees in front of me. "You can fix this!" Connor gasped, his eyes wide with frantic, blinding hope. "You can scrub the data. You are a genius, Imani. You just said it yourself. You see the code in 3 dimensions. If you can find the offshore accounts, you can delete them. You can encrypt the routing numbers. You can generate a sanitized report for my family's lawyers. You can make the $28 million look like a standard market loss. You can save me." Kiara crawled across the imported rug, her designer dress bunching around her knees. She pushed Connor aside, reaching out with trembling fingers to grab the hem of my cashmere trousers. I did not move. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the golden child, who was now quite literally groveling at the feet of the defective outcast. Please, Imani. Kiara sobbed her tears, leaving dark, wet streaks across my face. Please. We are twins. We shared a womb. We share the same blood. You cannot let them take my medical license. You cannot let them lock me in a federal prison. I would not survive it. You know I would not survive it. Just log into the clinic's billing matrix. You can alter the Medicare codes. You can make the fraudulent claims disappear. You are brilliant enough to hack the system and wipe the slate clean. Name your price. I will give you anything. I will give you half the clinic. I will give you everything I have. Just doctor the audit. Beatrice rushed forward, completing the pathetic circle of desperation. She pushed her way past her husband and her son-in-law, falling to her knees right next to Kiara. She reached out and grabbed my hand, her grip bruising and frantic. Imani, my sweet, brilliant girl. Beatrice wept, her voice dripping with a sickening, manufactured maternal warmth that made my stomach turn. I am so sorry. I am so sorry for everything I said today. I was just stressed. I was just worried about the gala. I did not mean any of it. You are not slow. You are not a burden. You are a miracle. You are the savior of this family. We need you. Your father and I will go to jail if the FBI sees those clinic guarantor documents. You would not send your own mother and father to a federal penitentiary, would you? We are family, Imani. Family protects family. Blood is thicker than water. I looked down at the four of them. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of their pleas was almost beautiful in its absolute depravity. Just 20 minutes ago, they had threatened to lock me in a psychiatric facility. They had threatened to smear the legacy of the only man who had ever truly loved me. They had repeatedly called me slow, defective, and not smart enough to understand basic reality. And now they were begging the slow child to commit a massive, highly coordinated act of federal cybercrime to save them from their own greed. I gently but firmly pulled my hand out of Beatrice's crushing grip. I took a single step back, forcing Kiara to let go of my trousers. I looked at the four faces staring up at me, illuminated by the cold blue light of the projection screen. Family protects family. I repeated, my voice completely devoid of any inflection. Blood is thicker than water. That is a fascinating philosophy, Beatrice. Tell me, did blood feel thicker than water when you packed my childhood belongings into trash bags and legally signed away your parental rights? Did family protect family when you dropped me off at Uncle Silas's house because paying for my dyslexia tutors would have cut into your country club budget? Beatrice flinched, fresh tears spilling over her mascara-stained cheeks. We made a terrible mistake, she wailed, pressing her hands together in prayer. We were young. We were foolish. We did not know how to raise a child with your special gifts. We were intimidated by your potential. But we love you. We have always loved you. Please, Imani, do not let them take everything we have built. Desmond dropped to his knees right beside his wife. The proud, booming patriarch was now kneeling on my floor, his head bowed in absolute defeat. I will do anything, Desmond begged, his voice cracking. I will publicly apologize to you in front of the entire church congregation. I will give you the deed to Silas's land free and clear. We will not take a single dime of the $15 million. It is all yours. Just redact the files. Just press delete. You have the power to make all of this go away with a few keystrokes. I let their pathetic, desperate bargaining hang in the air. I let them offer me the very things that already belonged to me. They were offering me the land they had tried to steal. They were offering me fake performative apologies to save their own skin. They were looking at me not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as a magic wand that could instantly erase their sins. You want me to doctor a forensic audit requested by the Kensington estate, I said, looking directly at Connor. You want me to commit federal wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence to cover up your embezzlement. You want me to risk the multi-million-dollar corporate intelligence firm I built from nothing just to save a man who told me I was not smart enough to understand high finance. I shifted my gaze to Kiara, who was trembling so violently her teeth were visibly chattering. You want me to wipe out the digital footprints of a $4 million Medicare scam? I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. You want me to risk my own freedom to protect a woman who just threatened to use her medical license to have me declared legally incompetent and locked in a psychiatric ward? You want the defective slow burden to risk federal prison to save the flawless golden child? Julian stepped up beside me, the subtle, terrifying presence of the former federal prosecutor casting a long, dark shadow over the kneeling family. He looked down at them with absolute professional disgust. My wife built her empire on absolute, unshakable integrity, Julian stated, his voice ringing with quiet authority. Vanguard Forensic Partners does not alter data. We do not negotiate with financial terrorists. And we certainly do not commit federal crimes to protect people who tried to extort us in our own home. But you are family, Beatrice screamed, her voice tearing with pure, unfiltered panic. She reached out again, her fingers clawing desperately at the empty air between us. You cannot do this to your own blood. You cannot let them destroy us. Please, Imani. I am your mother. I gave you life. You owe me. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had relentlessly tried to break my spirit and erase my humanity simply because my brain worked differently than hers. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No anger, no sadness, just the cold clinical detachment of a surgeon removing a malignant tumor. You say I owe you, I said, letting the words hang in the freezing air of the living room. You say I owe you because you gave me life. But giving birth is simply biology. Being a mother requires a soul, and you sold yours to a country club decades ago. You do not get to cash in on a biological technicality when you are staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. I looked at the four of them, a pathetic tableau of ruined elites groveling on my custom rug. They were still hoping for a miracle. They were still praying that the ingrained societal expectation of family loyalty would magically override their decades of relentless abuse. They truly believed they could weaponize the concept of blood to save themselves from a concrete jail cell. You came into my sanctuary today and called me slow, I stated, pacing slowly around the coffee table, forcing them to turn their heads to follow my movements. You called me slow when you threw the contract on my table. You called me slow when you waved your fraudulent check in my face. You called me slow when you threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward. You repeated the word over and over, trying to carve it back into my skull. Slow, slow, slow. I stopped right in front of Beatrice, looking down into her wide, terrified eyes. You were right, I whispered, my voice dropping to a deadly, resonant calm. I am a little slow. I am incredibly slow when it comes to forgetting the day you drove me away. I am exceptionally slow when it comes to unseeing the smug smile on Kiara's face as I packed my trash bags. And I am absolutely fundamentally slow when it comes to forgiveness. I turned my gaze to Julian. I gave him a single deliberate nod. Julian did not speak. He did not gloat. He simply raised his sleek black tablet, tapped the illuminated screen twice, and swiped his finger across the glass. The quiet digital chime confirmed the action. It was a tiny, harmless sound, but in that living room it struck like the final toll of a death knell. What did he just do? Connor demanded, his voice cracking violently as he scrambled backward on his knees, his eyes darting frantically between Julian's tablet and my face. What did you just do? I looked at Connor, letting a perfectly cold, serene smile touch my lips. Vanguard Forensic Partners operates on a protocol of absolute transparency with federal regulators, I explained, dismantling his final desperate illusion of control. When we uncover undeniable evidence of massive systemic financial crimes, we do not wait for our clients to give us permission to report it. We are legally obligated to protect the integrity of the financial markets. The moment Richard Sterling wired that $2 million retainer and granted us access to your servers, your fate was sealed. I pointed to the projection screen where the red warning lights of their illicit transactions continued to pulse like a dying heartbeat. I did not need to doctor the audit. I continued my words, striking them like physical blows. I did not need to press delete. 10 minutes ago, while you were busy threatening to smear my uncle's legacy and commit me to an asylum, an automated unredacted copy of the Kensington primary audit was transmitted via secure encrypted server directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Simultaneously, the Buckhead Dermatology and Wellness Forensic file was forwarded directly to the Atlanta field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The air was entirely sucked out of the room. A collective, horrifying gasp erupted from the floor. No Kiara shrieked a high-pitched, animalistic sound, tearing from her throat. No, Imani. Please tell me you are lying. Please tell me you did not send it. They will revoke my license. They will seize the clinic. I will go to prison. Tell me you are lying. I am not lying, I said, watching her pristine golden child facade completely disintegrate into raw, unfiltered panic. The FBI already has the patient logs. The IRS already has the offshore routing numbers. The algorithms flagged the exact timestamps of your fraudulent Medicare submissions and matched them perfectly to the margin call deposits in Connor's Cayman Island shell accounts. The paper trail is bulletproof. The digital footprint is undeniable. There is no negotiation. There is no out-of-court settlement. Federal agents are likely preparing the arrest warrants as we speak. Desmond collapsed entirely, his forehead resting against the cold marble floor. He let out a deep, agonizing groan, the sound of a proud, status-obsessed man realizing he was going to spend the rest of his life answering to a federal warden. His respectability politics, his front-row seat at the mega-church, his country club memberships, all of it was gone, reduced to ash by the very daughter he had discarded. He knew the church board would excommunicate him before sunset. He knew the country club would revoke his access the moment the news broke. Beatrice began to hyperventilate, rocking back and forth on her knees, clutching her designer handbag as if it could somehow shield her from a federal indictment. She was muttering to herself, a frantic, disjointed stream of prayers and denials, her mind completely unable to process the apocalyptic destruction of her carefully curated reality. She realized that the ladies in her prayer circle were going to watch her do a perp walk on the evening news in her custom silk suit. The sheer inescapable humiliation of it was already suffocating her. I stepped over to the paper shredder, reaching into the transparent bin. I pulled out a handful of the shredded paper confetti that used to be Connor's arrogant, desperate personal check. I walked over to where he was kneeling, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his ruin. He knew his father would publicly disown him to save the Kensington name. He knew he was utterly and completely alone. I let the shredded paper fall from my hand, the tiny white pieces fluttering down to land on his expensive tailored suit and polished Italian leather shoes. You offered me $100,000, I said, looking down at the broken, weeping heir to the Kensington Empire. You told me to take the handout. You told me to buy a small apartment and be grateful that my betters were taking care of me. You thought you could buy a $15 million federal highway payout with a fraudulent piece of paper from a bankrupt account. I leaned in slightly, ensuring he heard every single syllable. I suggest you start liquidating whatever assets your father has not already frozen, Connor. Because when the Department of Justice unseals those indictments, the government is going to freeze every single penny tied to your name. You are going to need a phenomenal criminal defense attorney. And those elite Ivy League corporate litigators you bragged about, they do not work for free. You are going to need every single cent of that $100,000 just to keep yourself out of a maximum security cell before trial. You are not a king anymore, Connor. You are just another desperate criminal about to be processed through the federal system. They stayed on the floor, weeping, hyperventilating, entirely crushed by the inescapable weight of their own actions. They had walked into my home as conquerors, expecting to easily manipulate a defective, slow victim. Instead, they had handed me the exact weapons I needed to legally, systematically, and permanently destroy their lives. They had dug their own graves with their greed, their arrogance, and their relentless cruelty, and I had simply provided the dirt to bury them. The security guards shoved all four of them out onto the front driveway and pulled the heavy custom mahogany doors shut. The solid metallic thud of the deadbolt locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a generational curse being permanently severed. The grand living room fell instantly blissfully silent. The suffocating toxic energy they had brought into my sanctuary was gone. I took a deep cleansing breath, feeling the clean, conditioned air fill my lungs. Then, cutting through the thick glass of my floor-to-ceiling windows, I heard it. It started as a low, distant wail carrying across the manicured lawns of my elite neighborhood. The sound grew steadily louder, sharper, and more urgent. Sirens, multiple sirens approaching rapidly from the direction of the main highway. The automated systems at Vanguard Forensic Partners had done exactly what they were programmed to do. The federal authorities were not waiting for Monday morning. They were moving in right now to secure the flight risk targets and freeze the compromised assets. Connor and Kiara would not even make it back to their Buckhead mansion before the federal agents intercepted them. I turned away from the windows. Julian dismissed the two Vanguard associates with a nod. They locked their steel briefcases, gave me a respectful bow, and retreated silently back into my home office. Julian walked over to me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pressing a warm, grounding kiss to my temple. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew I was entirely victorious. I walked back to the seating area. Julian's parents were still sitting on the velvet sofa. They had watched the entire explosive confrontation without making a single sound. His mother, the brilliant retired professor, leaned forward and calmly picked up the delicate porcelain teapot. She poured a fresh stream of steaming Earl Grey into my cup. She looked up at me, a fierce, unwavering pride shining in her eyes. "Your tea is getting cold, Imani," she said, her voice perfectly smooth and elegant. And we were just getting to the best part of the documentary discussion. I smiled, feeling a profound wave of gratitude wash over me. This was family. Not the people who shared my blood, but the people who respected my mind, honored my boundaries, and sat calmly by my side while I eradicated the monsters from my past. I sat down next to Julian, picking up my warm teacup by its delicate handle. Before taking a sip, my eyes drifted up to the marble mantelpiece above the roaring fireplace. Resting in a silver frame was a black and white photograph of Uncle Silas. He was holding his vintage saxophone, his head thrown back in mid-laugh, his eyes crinkling with that wild, free-spirited joy he carried everywhere. He was the man my parents called a failure. He was the man who looked at a terrified, discarded 12-year-old girl and saw absolute genius. He taught me that I was not broken. He taught me that the world is simply a giant sheet of music, and you just have to learn how to read the hidden notes. Toxic people will always try to force you into tiny, suffocating boxes. They will weaponize your differences. They will label you as slow, defective, or a burden simply because your brilliance makes them feel terribly inadequate. They need you to be small so their fragile, hollow egos can feel massive. My biological family traded me away for a pristine credit score and a front-row seat at a megachurch. They spent 18 years telling themselves a comforting lie about the daughter they abandoned. But you can never keep a true apex predator locked in a cage built of lies. They thought my non-linear brain was a tragic flaw. They had absolutely no idea that I would take the very trait they despised and forge it into an untouchable multi-million-dollar weapon. I built a global empire by seeing the invisible patterns they were too arrogant to notice. I did not just survive their abuse. I monetized my survival, and I used it to legally and systematically dismantle their entire existence. I took a slow, calming sip of my tea, savoring the rich bergamot flavor. The sirens outside grew louder, a screaming chorus of justice echoing through the Atlanta afternoon. The golden child was going to a federal penitentiary. The wealthy savior was entirely bankrupt. The status-obsessed parents were going to lose everything they had sacrificed me to build. And the slow, defective, burdensome daughter was sitting in her multi-million-dollar estate, drinking tea with the family she chose, watching her empire thrive. Sometimes the absolute best revenge is not destroying your enemies. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting them drown in the inescapable, catastrophic consequences of their own unmitigated greed. while you sit back and enjoy the unbreakable peace you fought so incredibly hard to build. The most profound lesson from this story is that toxic people will always try to weaponize your differences, labeling your unique traits as flaws or burdens to elevate their own fragile egos. However, the very characteristics they despise can become the foundation of your greatest power. When you stop seeking validation from those who abandoned you and instead embrace your authentic self, you become unstoppable. True family is not determined by bloodline or societal status, but by those who respect your mind and protect your peace. Ultimately, the most devastating revenge is simply building an untouchable empire from the bricks they threw at you. If you have ever had to cut ties with a toxic environment to build your own empire, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories of resilience, and let me know in the comments how you turned your struggles into your greatest strengths.